We are doing it live for real. It's kicking off. I think my YouTube page just reloaded. It says that it's the weirdest thing. It always says live streaming isn't available now, right when your live stream starts. Strangest thing. Anyway, it does look like we are live. Hopefully everybody can hear us and things are working good and everybody's here and excited to listen to me and Jason talk about game dev stuff and have fun. We've been kind of going at it for the first, I don't know, for a while here before we started and went live. So probably should have just hit the button a minute ago. I was just showing Jason the arcade cabinet setup that I was swapping out and changing and doing a video about that later, by the way. So wait, now I'm all off center. Look at that. I'm in a weird position because I moved my camera around. Anyway, if you aren't already subscribed, make sure that you are now so that you hit the button and hit that like button so that when this ends, when you're done watching this, you can come watch the thing about the arcades and all the fun stuff there. Anyway, thanks again, Jason, for being here and welcome. Everybody say hi to Jason in chat. Hi, Jason. So yeah, man, it's been good talking to you and all these calls, man. I have a blast like every week, and it's really weird having two versions of it. So I'm gonna drag this over here. Stop seeing two of your face bouncing around. It's confusing the crap out of me. Anyway, how have you been, man?
Good. I've been a bit of a busy week. I've been, as you know, I do actually have a day job. Well, I'm self-employed, but I do work. So this is sort of this stuff, as fun as it is mostly a hobby. So I tend to enjoy the de-stressing. But yeah, it's been good. I've managed to have a bit of time to clean up my office and do a bit of. I even swept and mopped the floors, did a whole lot of stuff this weekend. So it's a good way to use your time.
Yeah, I need to do that. The whole sweeping and mopping thing. Actually, did I ever tell you the story about my story about robots and sweeping and mopping?
I don't think so.
This was I don't know if I should admit this on live, but this was a couple of years ago. I guess it's been 4 or 5 years ago. My wife had to leave for a little while. Her dad got sick. She had to fly out of state, kind of emergency style. Left the state to go help him for I think it was about 6 weeks that she was gone. And during that time, I was like, okay, well, I guess I got to take over the house stuff that she normally deals with, doing the dishes, the laundry, sweeping and mopping and all the stuff that she does. I mean, she did a lot of things. So those are the ones that I could remember. Right? So anyway, 3 days in, I was like, holy shit, this is overwhelming. I can't do this. I can't sweep and mop. I already did laundry and tried to do the dishes. But instantly, I was like, there's got to be a way to automate this. I was like, there's got to be some tech that makes it happen. There's got to be a robot that can just do this whole thing. So yeah, within a week, I'd ordered up a Roomba and a mopping bot to mop the floor and one to vacuum.
I didn't even know there was mopping bots. I knew Roombas existed, but
I've got a new version of the mop bot now that maps out the Roomba and stuff and just maps out the whole place and mops it. And it's not no, I theoretically I could mop the house and clean it up, but I had dirty ass kids. I got a lot of kids. They're little and dirty, running around in and out the house. It was a mess, and I had way too much to do. So it was either the house was gonna fall apart, or I was gonna get robots. And really, what happened was kind of both. I got robots, and the house still fell apart. It just fell apart a little tiny bit less. Yeah, robots are good. I can't wait until robots handle a lot of stuff, so I can just make games.
I basically treat that as a moment of de-stressing personally. So what I do is, because I spend so much time sitting at my computer, any chance I get to just sort of put on a pair of Bluetooth. Well, I use my headphones with the Bluetooth dongle, and then I can just sort of spend a day cleaning the house, and it's I get to not turn on a computer for a whole 7 hours. It's very relaxing. So I actually take solace and enjoy the whole cleaning the house portion as a break.
That makes sense. I think I've got a lot of things constantly pulling me away. So, for me, when I'm away doing those things, if it's something that I'm not interested in, obviously I'm having fun with the kids and family and stuff, that's a blast. But if I'm doing something that I'm not interested in, I'm constantly I could be writing some code or recording a video or anything else. But I guess just the distractions. I have other things that I like to do to distract myself, though. Yeah,
Yeah, that's
people
fair. I
are
mean, you're
saying
supposed to
your
be playing
mic
games,
sounds a
right?
little bit weird, which is strange.
Yeah, yeah.
Sounds
Is
okay
it?
to
I
me.
mean,
I
if
don't
there
know.
is other issues, let me know.
Hopefully it's better now. So yeah, robots are the way. I firmly believe that one day we'll have droids just roaming around the house like Star Wars, dealing with most of the stuff that's non-mental
Well, just
or
just in case it was
non-belief.
using the wrong mic there, I've made sure it should be using this one now. So
Oh yeah, you sound
hopefully
like a
that's
totally
better.
different person. Oh,
Okay, good. There we
okay.
go. So this
Yeah,
this
I
is the
didn't
proper
realize
mic. I
that.
don't know what mic it was using then.
Huh, I
Must
don't
have been the
know.
actual must have been the actual camera mic then. Hmm.
Using the one from a mile away. Yeah. Well, that definitely sounds better, man.
Okay, there we go. Yeah. So this is the mic I'm actually talking into. Otherwise, that's ridiculous. I was talking into this, but the other one picked me up.
I want to switch to a different mic now. Try that out. Anyway, yeah. Just looking through chat. So anyway, again, welcome everybody. I don't know exactly what we're talking about this week. Game dev related stuff. There were a couple different things that we wanted to, I think, both bring up, but nothing, no one singular topic, I guess. So make sure that you hit the like
Hmm.
button and subscribe and all that. While we get, oh, man, this camera positioning is so weird. It's freaking me out. I like moved everything. I gotta not turn my camera around. Anyway, hit those buttons and we'll get going. So yeah, what should we jump into first? Do you have any preferences, Jason?
Um, Not really. Again, as I think I was saying before, is I see a lot of comments that are asking about coding specific problems whenever we're having more of a chill podcast vibe. So I always feel bad. I usually make a note of kind of to get around to it next time. So I think while we're here, if anybody has programming questions, it might be a good chance to get through a few of those.
Yeah, we could do that. And there was one that actually got sent to me in email that I was going to share. Let me see if I can pop that thing up. Let me save it real quick as a picture and then screen share it real quick. How do I do that? Let's see if I can figure out
Oh,
how to
and
use.
also because I forgot last time, and I felt a bit awkward that I couldn't think of any tips until later on. I wrote down a couple of them this time preemptively. So usually once some topic comes up, I can come up with some tips for it. But without the prompt, it's hard to. So I wrote down a few in advance of like vaguely pro builder tips, vaguely a few other tips for different things, and so hopefully now there'll be a couple to go with.
That's awesome. I'm excited to hear them, especially as you already gave me one pro builder tip before we even got started. So this email came in, and I've been waiting to reply to it. I marked it, and I was thinking about maybe even just doing a video on it. But this seems like a good place to just talk about it too. And he said that they're currently enrolled in my course and wondering if they could ask unrelated question about the kids game tutorial that I made on YouTube a while back. This was just a video. It was a really simple one, kind of showing like an intro on how to make a game for kids, where we popped up random numbers of fruit. I think it was. It was different sprites. You could put whatever sprites, and then a set of numbers. I think it was 1 through 9, and the kid had to pick the number of things that were on the screen. There's actually a weird issue where like the cherries technically had 2 cherries on there, so wondering if they would mix it up, but they were all fine. The kids still kind of got like what the objects were. Anyway, so they're working on a similar game where the player clicks the letter or clicks, I guess, the right number from a small selection of them, or maybe it is letters, and then they want to have an option to generate a slot that contains a random set of numbers, and then the player has to choose the right numbers. So I'm a little confused on it, but I think that the goal is like essentially the same kind of thing, but you're picking random sets of numbers and random sets of things and then linking them together. Um,
Yeah. I mean, if it's basically data sets, so we're kind of talking about some kind of repository, right? It's just sort of like get me stuff and then have preset lists of almost like level layouts, right? Like a set of example stuff.
yeah, essentially. And they want to know how they could make 2 different sets and just choose between them at random on GameStar. So they just want to kind of like pre-make these sets of them and then pick between them. The letters and numbers are sprites, and they need to be able to change them to something like fruits or animals in the future. They just kind of want to be able to link them
Hmm.
up and change them. And I mean, there are a lot of ways to do it. I would definitely recommend diving into scriptable objects to hold that data. I think maybe prefabs to hold that data, depending on how complicated it is and how big this project is. You might just be able to slap in a couple prefabs and spawn those out. But I think that scriptable objects are probably going to be a good starting point. But I just kind of wanted to hear your thoughts on it before I
Yeah,
go
I,
into
I think
my.
I think my starting instinct would be so you basically have some view component that's basically a card or a tile, and it might have references to whatever images and things, and then you would basically my personal thing would be I'd create a text file, and each line would be whatever collection of 1 8 5 2 7 3 2 whatever the level is, and then I would just pass in a text asset reference, iterate through whichever one, make a list of them, pick one randomly, and then I would iterate and either set or instantiate each tile relative to the number that arrive in the text file. That way I can make more levels by just editing the text file, and there's kind of the one tile object that's repeated and replace the content in it. At least I think if I
Assuming you
understand the question.
don't have a need to edit it outside the editor, any reason you wouldn't just consider a scriptable object there to hold that same data instead of a
Well, I
text
guess it's an
file?
argument of what's faster. Like I understand that a scriptable object might seem faster, but for me, like I can just write five lines in a text file and then write a single line that says, read all lines, and then for each line create thing. It doesn't strike me as any more extra work. And the thing I like about text
It is
files
a little
is
bit of extra work though, because you have to convert
mm,
those references from strings into like the actual prefab references or the image references or whatever it is that you're gonna
I
display.
guess I
Right?
guess one of those
There's
things
still a
I
little bit of
just do
extra
that so
plumbing there that
often.
you've got to do. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
just
I just
become
that's
instinctive. You don't even recognize the code
yeah.
is there.
Because from my perspective, it's like iterating a collection of something to do something is kind of such a common structural thing. I wouldn't even call it a pattern. It's not quite that complex, but it's the idea that I don't really care. I've said this before. I don't really care where I get my data from, and so I try not to think about it too much. And the reason I would use scriptable objects is actually because I'd want to configure it in the editor. And once I go down that road, I tend to kind of lean towards building custom inspector tools. So if I know it's just for me and it's basically like programmer to programmer or whatever, a text file is something a programmer could open up, easily see all of the data in the least amount of syntax possible, no clicking around or editor tools or anything, just like change a few lines. And it's almost like a coding language, kind of like a DSL specifically for the problem you're solving. So I know it might be a little bit more technical from that perspective, but it just seems really easy to me to have a text file that says each level is 118, 182, 587, whatever. Each one's a level, and then I can go in and change a few numbers, and then it works instantly without having to go and like structure and make prefabs and drag them into references and do all of that stuff.
Interesting. Yeah, I get the idea. It just seems for me, I feel like the opposite. Like for me, I think I would have done that way, but now I'm very much in the boat of like I think setting them up in the editor would be a little bit easier for me. It'd save me time and not having to manually map like the file name to what the picture looks like saves me a ton. Like being able to just go in there, click on it and see it, or see it in a little thing. I can just
Mm.
pop up, make a little tiny inspector so I can see them. Um,
I think the
but,
reason I'm
but either
biased
way, I
against
mean,
that is I
uh,
remember a long time ago. So my sort of programming style is because I use a lot of keyboard shortcuts and move around. What I tend to do is I write the name of a new script at the bottom of an old script, and then I
yep,
will move it out. So there's Alt Enter will like extract it and move it out its own file. Now, if you do that with in the script that's turning into a scriptable object, you can if you so basically I have a script, some mono behavior at the bottom of it. I put a scriptable object. Now, if I make a reference to that object, like a data object, and then I make a bunch of them, like use the context menu and make a bunch of scriptable objects. If I move that file out now, it will break all of those references to the data objects because the position and name of the file has changed relative because it'll generate a new GUID for it. And that's freaked me out a few times and configured my data wrong and messed with stuff. And so the thing I like about a text file is it's repeatable. I don't have
it
to
seems
worry
like
about
it
it
shouldn't
doing
let
anything.
you do that. Like if the create
Yeah.
asset menu shouldn't allow. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong, but I feel biased that like it should have the same requirement as mono behavior. Like it shouldn't work even in the asset menu until it's in its own
Yeah,
class or
but it
in
would
its
let
own
you. It'll let
file.
you build it, and then
Like
you can get
that
yourself in
yeah,
trouble.
I've never
Yeah.
run into that issue because I always just have a habit of instantly moving them. I just really hate having multiple classes in a file most of the time. Um, but again, personal. It's totally a personal thing. I've never run into that, so that's an interesting bug though to watch out
Mm.
for. It's
And
something I
then
should
as for the
teach. I
comment
got I
about
gotta
using
show
it,
that and now in an example and teach
yeah,
them.
yeah, because it's like
Like
it genuinely like I once spent like an hour filling in scriptable objects for various different things. I think it was a little miniature localization system, and then I just said, "Oh, now to tidy my code," and then the act of tidying the code broke every reference.
broke
And there's not a quick way to do it. There's not
no.
like a refind and attach it. At least not that I can see. So it basically just says cannot find the object because all the GUIDs have changed. And so unless someone knows something I don't, it was like all of the data is there technically and serialized, but I have no way to access it because it won't recognize the script reference. And so I ended up finding no way to get it back. And so it was like just wasted all of that time. So a text file to me is easily there and repeatable. And if the worry is about the performance costs of doing it every time, well, you could always just have a button in the inspector that does it at editor time. So it's exactly the same thing, but it means it's now repeatable and separate, and you're not relying on Unity serialization. So just that's just my own personal paranoia, I guess.
No, that's fair. Everybody's got their own like battle scars, you know. Things that they don't do because something went terrible. I get it. Um, yeah, for me, the text files. I was always a big fan of putting everything in text files for a very long time, and I don't know. I've slowly just grown to not like them nearly as much. I don't know. I
But see,
guess
I'm
maybe
I'm
it's just
exactly
like
the other
I've
way
gotten
around.
a lot more comfortable. Oh
I
yeah,
used to I used to hate text files. I used to think that they were unnecessarily obtuse and complicated when you could just. But I would either favor using databases because the idea was even though it's more technical in terms of making a database, it's very clean in terms of the contract because you're normally just saying get me this thing, and you can use like entity framework or something, and so it feels very code like. And if you go one step further and use like DB migrations or code first databases or something, you can end up like you never have to think about the data. But the more I started to work in bigger projects and the more you actually have to think about the data and start writing your own normalized databases to be more performant and all of that, it made me kind of realize that if the trade-off is right in lacking performance database or a fully performant database or use a text file, I kind of just like the text file because it's just simple and works. So I sort of went the other way, which is funny.
I think that makes sense in comparison to databases, especially for a lot of things. A lot of people just kind of jump to using a database to store just about anything, and it can be really handy, especially because tools are just built to just work on top of it. You want to have a web interface for your data, you can just take a bunch of them and just slap them at your database, give them access, and it'll automatically generate stuff. Right? You really don't have to do a lot, but yeah, there's a whole huge that technical, I guess, cost, the technical debt and cost of just setting that up, maintaining that, managing it, upgrading it, and then the cost of adding anything. Because every time you want to insert stuff or change your schema in a database, huge. Changing it in a text file, relatively simple. You just have to upgrade some like little parser or something. Um,
Yeah. And one
so-
thing that Shane says here in the comments is databases handle a lot more than text files. What happens when your file fails to write or gets corrupted? Well, just like any other data management, you have to manage your data. So I'm not just arbitrary. Like, for example, another thing is what if there's no space on the drive that you're writing to and it corrupts? So there's a load of ways that can go wrong. But if you've done enough work with text file, the pattern is relatively straightforward. You check if a file exists. If it does exist, you copy it, you give a .back extension so it exists and it's still there. You then make it hidden, and then you work on the one that you're doing. You write your changes and do whatever you need to, effectively treating it like a transaction. If something goes wrong, you roll back and restore the old text file. And then that covers you in case of a lot of those things that go wrong. And you can often leave the previous .back file there too if there's enough storage. So you can always have sort of a hidden backup file in the directory where the file is stored. So there's that. There's a whole lot of other stuff too. We talked before about if the question is, flat files being flat, well, that's what JSON's for, right? Like you can have structured data in a text file too. That's not really a problem. In fact, we've got a whole world now full of flat file style database structures. If you go past the SQL architecture, like we live in a world now where there's AWS have an entire table architecture where you do all of your work through table data, and you can actually use it for pretty complex applications. So, I mean, don't get me wrong, I love SQL. We talked about this before. SQL is amazing. It lets you do a lot of cool stuff, but it's a query language. It's in the name for querying. So, like the benefits you get are querying. If you're about storing data, you don't really need much more than the ability to just have a load of lines somewhere, and those lines can be in tables or those lines can be in flat files or whatever format you like, as long as you can index and reference them in a way that's efficient. And with text files, like I can jump to line 12 if I know I want the 12th item, and providing the structure of that text file is consistent, I mean, it works. Again, there obviously are concerns, and you have to watch the edge cases, but there's no reason not to use them if they solve the purpose you need. And so oftentimes basic storage can be fine with text files until they're not, and then your question becomes, do you upgrade towards API stuff because it's easier and remote and has more security, or do you upgrade to scriptable object approaches because you need more tooling and editor stuff or whatever? All of those are next level decisions to make.
Yeah, I can think of just one of those scenarios where that kind of happened, where it started off with text files and it was totally fine and the best, and then definitely caused some problems. And some of the things that they ran into was with EverQuest. So it's a game I used to play. I don't know I'm sure if you played it in chat, just
I've definitely played EverQuest before.
Played EverQuest before, right? So it was built in the late 90s, I guess, mid to late 90s, and all of the data for characters, at least even into the 2000s, was stored in text files in a folder structure. So like every server had its own folder structure. Underneath there's characters, and like the character name was like the next folder, and under there's like items folder and text files holding the item data. There's a text file holding the character data. And it's basically just a folder structure full of files holding all of that character stuff. And like I said, it works great for what they needed, right? Like they're able to load the data up really quick. They can easily check to see if a character exists, just check to see if the file path exists. File path exists, character exists. Bam, load it up, just read in the files that are all the same file name, just in that subfolder or in that format, right? It worked great for that kind of stuff, but then when you want to get actual aggregate data, nearly impossible, right? So
And
getting
again,
like
that's it, right? You can't query it, right?
yeah, you can't query it. Yeah, it's not set up for querying. It's just not the kind of thing where you can go in and like find important data. To find important data, people are writing things like Perl scripts to go search through all of the text files and generate a report of like who has the most money on a server, or like tiny little things. It's not like they could report on much at all. They got to like pick a thing to have a developer sit there, program up the query to write it and parse through all these text files, and then go manually run it on all these things. So in that case,
yeah, and that's one of those things people don't realize too.
Great.
Even with a database, people don't realize that this is a problem, because just because you're using a database that's normalized to whatever second normal form and has all of your different tables, doesn't mean querying is a good idea. It just means it's capable of querying. So if you ever worked in big data stuff, where you're like, for example, I worked on a system which was aggregating supermarket data, and it would tell you foot traffic per day, products that were sold, how many products per basket, and then we'd have to cross-reference that with the weather and all the other different features of, how do you track the price elasticity of certain products? And you'd think that's a lot of data to go through. And if you're just looping queries on a database full of like hundreds of thousands of stuff from multiple stores in multiple different branches for multiple different stuff, it's just impractical. You can't do it. So what you tend to do is you'd actually run processes on that data set to generate other data sets. And so what tends to be done is you'd spin off either on Azure or on AWS some web service that whenever a table changes or at certain times of day, you'd iterate through all of it, run a stored procedure, and say, get me the totals for this store's sales or for this store's products or whatever else. And then once all of those are done, you'd have other services that would then read those and go, based on the compounds, totals, and whatever else, generate this data, and then finally generate reports. So data isn't always valuable in the raw format it's in. And if you want to have, so the reason we did all of this is there's a general concept of tables, and that we're kind of more familiar with just the normal XY axis tables, but there's other stuff too. There's like Excel tables, which are just the cells in them, but there's other tables like pivot tables. Now, pivot tables are really cool because it lets you pick data to automatically chart against other data. So say there's like 12 different sets of properties, number of people in the store that day, number of products sold, number of, the total amount sold, the percentage of stuff that was sold that's from whatever category. And you'd like to be able to kind of, Yeah, you'd like to be able to figure out what the useful info is. And so what a pivot table lets you do is you actually drag fields into either axes, and it will generate this data in terms of like the graph and chart. But if it's doing that in real time, you've no chance. You're going to be waiting there for a long time for it to build every one of these queries. So we pre-bake the axes of those different questions, and you sort of query them yourself. So
And here
I
you're
guess my
talking about
point
at large
is,
scale, right? Like,
oh
because
yeah,
those
yeah, this
queries,
is
like if people watching do it in like Google Sheets or something, they can do a small query in a pivot and get it instantly. But you're talking like millions and
yeah,
millions of
yeah.
records,
But
lots
you're
and lots of
literally
stuff
talking
going
about
on there,
millions of millions of
right?
lines.
Where
Yeah.
it's not
So
instant, and you don't click it and it just pops up and changes.
and also, not only that, like the data set change. If you're talking about aggregating data that happens every few days, like the data sets are changing almost in real time, and you actually don't really want to try to keep up to date with that. You prefer to have it run off the cache set of data, and then at X time of day, you know that you'll get the new load of the previous set of data. Otherwise, the data is constantly changing, constant read writes, and then trying to read from a database that's being written to all of the time is also bad for performance and exhausting. So anyway, all of that aside, my point is that it's one thing to say SQL lets you query your data. Text files don't give you that power. But even then, even if you're going deep into the whole querying data thing, sometimes you have to still add layers of caching and pre-baked stuff and result sets just to get to the point that you can kind of ask the questions you want to ask.
Yeah, it's definitely true. And I just want to clarify, like, I'd still for saving content data in EQ or a game like that, I would go with the database now, right? I just want to clarify for anybody watching that's not sure. Like, if you're building one of those kinds of games now, an MMO or something, definitely use some sort of database. It could be SQL, NoSQL, whatever
Mm.
it is, but use something. And on your point of just the whole transformation of data and it not being useful in its raw form, I've got multiple instances. So, well, I've told people before I did a lot of tools development when I was at Sony. A lot of the things, or a couple of things that are relevant at least, that I did were building data transformation tools to get data that we wanted from the game out of basically usually raw logs, sometimes out of sales databases, but often out of just like raw log files that were generated and turning that into something that we could actually analyze and use to take things that have, a lot of time it'd be thousands to millions of log entries per server. Sometimes some of them, the bigger ones, are like hundreds of thousands per day of entries, and
Logs are always the
convert all
worst,
of
right?
that data into something useful because they have like no info on like how many people completed these quests, right? So like trying to find things like what quests are broken, what quests are nobody completing, and no way to find any of that data out because it just wasn't. There was no relation. There was no data stored. We had to go through basically log data for all kinds of stuff to figure this stuff out, and just build up a giant interface. So what I essentially ended up doing, it was very similar to what you mentioned, was building up a process that ran nightly, that run nightly and grab everything, and then it would run hourly and just grab updates of the important stuff that needed hourly updates. So the things that were like big analytical stuff, like who's talking to these NPCs, how long are players actually talking to NPCs, doing quests, like what areas do they care about? That stuff all come daily. Sales stuff, the things that the money people care about, those would come hourly. Right? So you just get like hourly updates on that kind of stuff. And then it'd build interfaces on top of that. So that would just put it all into something like a SQL database or a reporting database, and then build something on top of it so people can see it. Um,
I
yeah,
think that's
the
something that
data is
every
totally
dev
useless in its raw format.
I think that's something that every dev will end up doing if they ever work in enterprise at some stage is one, writing a tool to consume and make logs readable, and the other is specifically generating reports so that someone higher up can look at a sheet and go, "Oh yeah, that's fine." They're two things that I think everyone I know has done at some stage in their career.
Or they can make decisions. A lot of the time, getting that data actually led to them making relatively big decisions. It was kind of interesting because it was going from no data to pretty solid data of what was actually happening because we had the data. It was just again in a log format, and then the log formats, I said they're useless. They weren't useless for everybody. They were useful for the people that were using them, which was like the customer service team. We were just kind of repurposing them to make them also useful for data and analytics. But we would find things like items that did sell really well, and they'd start making more things like that. Things that didn't sell well, they'd stop making. Dialogue length. There was a lot of info that we kind of gathered on, like how long dialogue should be for NPCs, whether or not people would actually continue reading it, and like what percentage of people were reading all of the dialogue that was being written, especially when it got to certain points, and then like what areas were people going to, what things people were killing, what items seemed to be coming in very fast versus very slow, and how those lined up. So get a lot of that data to not just the producers, but also like the designers and stuff, so they could see how their stuff was performing. And they would also often just catch bugs. They'd be like, "Oh, nobody's got this item. Ah, crap! The drop rate was 0.1% instead of 10% or something. Like that's why it's broken." They'd find all kinds of data like that. It's definitely a
Mm.
good thing to do, and something. Yeah, I think you're right. Most people will do it in almost anything. I've done it in lots of game companies too. Just gotten analytics for almost every game that we've built. To be honest, I can think of you get some sort of analytics, and it's really easy now with like a Unity's analytics or any of the other ones. There's a lot of systems that are just out there that we just plug right in, and you get a bunch of data on what's going on in your game. Um,
Yeah, it definitely is valuable. And also, like a lot of people don't realize too, it's not just the data that's to your players and how the game is going. It's data relevant to how your systems are performing. So there's a general principle with enterprise style stuff, and again with large games too, um, of the general concept of a heartbeat or something similar. You've got like you don't really think about it, but when you request to download something about a game, you might be in a different country from a different server than where that game is stored. So what tends to happen in real life is you have content delivery networks, and content delivery networks will basically clone the real server over to multiple different country regional servers, and then they'll keep them up to date. So there's sort of like a lag time between those and other different things, and basically you want to make sure that everything is running, that everything is always on and stuff is working. And you'll have different service providers that'll promise you 98% uptime or whatever else. And you want to make sure that all of your services are running correctly. And so, as well as generating the data for your actual game, you also want to generate data for is everything working. So one thing that a lot of us have done at some point is make a hub screen of some kind, which is just a series of like graphs, charts, and buttons that say all of the servers are up, all of the systems are running. There's no like things turn red or green relative to whatever else, and then composite logs that'll show you if there's like errors with something being down or not running. So there's a lot of actual tool development behind the scenes for not just making the stuff for the games, but also for like ensuring it doesn't go down. If you watch any like behind the scenes of a game producer, not just from the development side, you'll often see they have a big screen that has like lots of bar charts and graphs that are like active real-time user data for how many people are on it and what they're doing and which areas are the most congested and all sorts of other stuff.
yeah, I remember we had those at Sony. There was a whole room, just big giant knock room, the network operations center, where they would monitor all of that stuff. They would keep an eye on what was going on with the servers, how many people were there, what things were happening. They could log in and kind of like watch people live, see what was going on. And then I remember going from that one though to riots. I got to tour the riot office. Theirs was, I mean, it was nuts compared, right? The one at Sony was cool. There were like three guys hanging out there till they had their three big screens up there, their systems, and it was nice. I was like, wow, this is awesome. But a riot, and it's like a theme park in there. It's like the whole wall is just screens all the way around this giant like 40-foot room with 40-foot ceilings and people everywhere. You couldn't actually go in there, but you could see inside there through the glass like aquarium window, right? And watch what was going on. There's all kinds of ridiculous amounts of data going up there. And I
Yeah,
think that
yeah.
as they get bigger, like those big companies like that scale out, they do like crazy analytic stuff where they just get nuts.
I got to see that for a banks once. It was great because so where I was working, I was working in like their tech small offices with a bunch of developers, and at one stage I got to go over to New York and see their data center, and there was exactly that. There's that room you go into where there's 50-inch monitors like wall to wall, and each one is showing these like lots of moving data of stuff, and it's like, yep, that's in Wappinger Falls, that's doing this, and it's all of this is like all around the world. There's this like data going on, and stuff is moving, and it's like that's crazy. And they're talking about millisecond count delays because it's transactions. So they're saying we can track exactly how many milliseconds a transaction will take from here to here and stuff. And yeah, it's crazy.
Wow, yeah. I mean, it helps though, I guess, if you've got live stuff and you got to catch issues live, right? Like, you got to have that board up there so you can see it. I've actually built some in the past for non-game setups where it actually mattered too, where we could see a dashboard in the place, and the second something went bad, it meant we were losing like thousands of dollars an hour. and had to fix it right away, and it saved us a couple times. So really handy to build. And I think I did that one using something like Grafana, the open source free tool. There's a
Yeah,
lot of
yeah.
free stuff out there to do it. I mean, and again, like you
Grafana is
said,
great too because you can expose like an endpoint on your API and just like connect to a couple of tables, and then there's actually a dashboard. You don't have to draw the dashboard yourself. You can just generate the different graphs from the data sets. It's awesome.
yeah, I really liked it. It was super handy. And I was using it a lot with AWS where it just kind of tied right in. But I've also, I was to say, used the Unity ones quite a bit. So the Unity
I haven't used
analytics.
Unity ones much. I haven't. I've only usually the analytics I've done have been sort of the manual tracked stuff or using like logging tools like Rollbar to externally send data. But I've never really had need for large scale remote tracking of data for games particularly.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I've used it a few times, and it's been a few years since I really dove into it in a production environment. But before, the only real well, there was one downside was that it was relatively slow. It took like a day to get the data. But aside from that, which is probably fixed by now, it was really cool because you could just add in a point wherever you want in your code, and then get a data point in the game, based on the user whenever they hit it. So you'd have those data points, and you could use them to like track when people picked up items, when people progressed through a level, where they were when they died. So you can just build out a heat map of like where they are when they die, like what those locations are, where they're not getting past, and all that stuff. You can figure out what's going on in your game and where the bottlenecks are. And I've used it quite a few times to find relatively useful info, especially you see that nobody in your game is getting past a certain point. Like you're going to instantly know that there's something wrong, or there's just a big drop off suddenly, give you an idea of where to tune things and where to fix stuff. So it's been super handy, and it's again extremely easy. Oh, and the other thing that it does magically is just catch bugs. Like catches crashes and errors. So if it crashes, if you've got a crash on your game that you don't know about because it doesn't happen on your system, doesn't happen in your dev environments, or doesn't happen on your phone, but it only happens on other people's phones, you get these full crash reports where you can go through and see and often just find out what the problem is, track it down without needing to reach out to anybody or reproduce it or anything. You can just see the error right there in the
And
code.
that's another like life pro tip to every dev who's out there. At some stage in your career, you'll find yourself saying the phrase, but it works on my machine. And stop yourself the minute you say that and realize how useless of a statement that is. Because all you've said is, for some reason, the configuration I have locally made it work. But what that could mean is when I made the build, there was a local file I have that I didn't push with it, or it could mean that my specific configuration is unique because I've been messing with it and I have all of these like SDK libraries. There's a million reasons why working on your machine means literally nothing. So you have to make sure that if someone comes back to you with a bug report and you try it on your machine and it doesn't work, have a test machine or give it to somebody else or something, because you'll feel attacked when somebody tells you something's broken and you try it and it's not broken for you. But like, you have to get over that. That's one of those instinctual, it works. I checked it works. I sent it out and it worked, but then it doesn't work for somebody else. And you'll feel like, but I did check that. Because, well, it doesn't always work that way. You have to accept that other machines are different than your own.
I've seen people do that many times and just lose their shit over it, lose their mind. I mean, I've gotten upset about it. I'm like, this thing works. It works. It's totally fine. I don't know what you're talking about. And then, finally, like, okay, let me go test it on my other system, right? So I just have like some other backup system around, or I'll go test it on the kid's computer or something. And like, oh shit, yep. And it's almost always what you said, a missing file that just didn't get shipped in there, or the files that got shipped were just somehow messed up. Something was wrong in there. It's very, very, very rarely something that's wrong on their system. It's not never. There have been cases, especially if you're working with somebody new and they're weird. Like there may be cases where they're like, oh yeah, no, I only run Windows in a Linux VM. So I don't they're like, oh, could have mentioned that, right? Or whatever it is. That could be some weird scenario. I've run into literally scenarios like that where people
Yeah, yeah.
just
We've had
let me
one
weird
before where
setup.
somebody said it wouldn't work, and it turns out that it's like they're on like, oh, I tried to install it on my office network, and it's like, oh, you mean the thing with like 8 levels of proxies? Yes, of course it's not going to work. We have no access to the network. How would you expect it? And it's like, okay, so that's a you thing. You have to requisition access. We can't just bake in access to your computer from our side. That doesn't work like that.
Oh yeah. I mean, I can't even remember the number of people that I've run into that like were trying to install things on an old operating system. Like, oh yeah, I don't want to upgrade to Windows XP, or I don't want to upgrade to Windows 10. I still use XP or whatever it is. And I'm like, okay, well, that's why your thing's not working. Like, go upgrade your damn thing or go upgrade your drivers. But most of the time, yeah, it's just developer error on actually delivering the thing in a working state. You just don't realize it because you're not using that delivered one, or you've got local packages that are cached or something. That was always a terrible one with .NET, the cached local packages
Yeah.
stuff.
And that gets even worse with websites. If you're working on
Yeah.
website development stuff, there's nothing worse than seeing it works fine. You deploy it, everyone's like, it looks really weird because you didn't clear your browser cache before you ran it to make sure that your version isn't storing an old version of the website, which has tripped me up many times as well.
Yeah. Luckily, we don't run into that too much with games. Hopefully. That said, I did release my night game to the web. I put it up on Simmer. Let me share it real quick in chat. Everybody can play my awesome night game. So I dropped it up there Thursday or Friday after making it. I'm gonna add in some more updates to it, but I dropped it in there so that the kid could play, go through, see if he liked it or not. He had lots of feedback. I think I mentioned this a little bit, but he found all the bugs, of course. So like he's clicking. For anybody that hadn't seen it, you can click it in the chat and play it on Simmer if you want. It's not difficult. It takes 2 seconds. You click the number of knights and then send them off to the right castle. But what he found was he could just keep tapping on the number of knights because I put a 1 second delay to stop him from spamming it. He was like, oh, I'll just keep spamming it anyway. And then, yeah, the guys disappear, sounds get weird. And then he also really wanted to click on all the interactables. So, like, anybody that's played Hearthstone or a game like that, where it's kind of like this board and there's some things that you have to work with, but then there's a lot of stuff in the background. In Hearthstone, like, all of the background stuff is interactable. It's like props, you click on it and something will happen, like a well will fill up, or some lava will come out, or a bird will go flying, or whatever the thing is that you click on. And he was essentially just kind of like looking for that interaction already at 4, having barely played any video games. Thinking, okay, it was an interesting one for me. I was like, I got to start putting more thought into these little interesting polished things. And Dave Green, who was here last time, he always does it. He's like master of just polishing up little things. Like every time I play something of his, there's a little thing in there there's a bunch of just little interactions and little like polished.
Yeah, so that's sort of a stolen principle from UX design, and it's called micro interactions, and it kind of has it sort of built a lot of popularity recently. You see this a lot whenever you have, I think it's kind of championed by the likes of Google and Apple, is whenever you click something and it has a little bounce or a little, not just the usual swiping, but sort of like a checkbox will do a little flip when it succeeds or something. All of these little micro interactions and things are really kind of where the web is moving. Everything is turning into these sort of responsive design things. So it's very interesting to see how that's a trend which has really taken off recently, where almost every app you use, like if you look at the way even swiping your drawer in an Android, there's like 9 different animations that play if you swipe from top to bottom. If you watch very carefully, there's like 9 different animations simultaneously playing.
What things are animating?
So in my case, when I swipe the drawer, the colors of the icons will change when the drawer passes over them from one color to another. If I pull down, it will fade the rate of the drawer items in relative to percentage of as I'm swiping differently per the different ones. They'll also move in onto their positions differently. And then when it gets to the bottom, it'll bounce. And then there's elements at the bottom that will fade up relative to the sliding down. So I don't know about you, but specifically on the Android version I've got, it's doing multiple sets of animations and also multiple phases of them. Like, I don't know if you can even see, but if I can. So if I was to pull down, you'll see. So if you watch carefully, there's these little fading ones at the bottom. This one bounces. This one comes in. Then if I go even further, these start to move. Each of these into line. Then the text comes in, and then this one at the top fades in. So notice how all of these individual things are all having their own different effects. And then the rate changes. If I bounce, it does something different than if I swipe. And then if I pull it up the other side, it does even more animations. So this is something that's been kind of coming up more and more. Yeah, it's fascinating. Like it's amazing how much detail if you watch. Like there's one. I don't think you can see it here because I don't have the theme on, but if I switch between light and dark theme, it has a different animation for changing the icons. It's interesting. It's just little details.
Yeah, that's crazy. It makes a big difference too. Like I said, even the toddler noticed it. So I'm gonna start doing a bit more of that. It's a bit more of those little you just call them micro interactions.
Yeah.
Or yeah, it's definitely something that I think adds a lot to the game. It's weird, like because one of the other games I play a lot of is Magic Arena, and I'm constantly clicking on the things in the background, and 90% of them don't do shit. So I'm just like, oh yeah, oh yeah. I was so used to Hearthstone, like from when I used to play that too much.
Yeah, I always
Anyway,
find too that this is one of those things that Nintendo was particularly good at. That they always said that the is that I can't remember if we've talked about this before, but from a design around the mechanics, and other companies design around the visuals. And because Nintendo is so focused on designing around the mechanics, every single element in the game is usually has some interaction to it. So if you punch any tree or climb any object or even like walk over any blade of grass, it will do something. There'll be like a little particle system, or there'll be a little sound effect, or it'll shake or whatever. So Nintendo was kind of the master of this, because almost any element visually there, and even way back to the older ones, whenever you had the overworld maps, a lot of the time the overworld maps, like the characters will jump relative to when you walk past them, and little things like this that all fall into that category.
yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that, but you're right. Like when I think of just any old Nintendo game or all the ones that still play, they're all the interactions are just everywhere. Interesting. It's a
I mean,
good
think
yeah.
about the fact that even the menus, the sound, right? Like they used to do it on the Nintendo console menus, where it would play the music and the music would change relative to the instant. There'd be a different chord for each menu item, so it would be playing music as you went up and down the menu with different sound effects. So there's like little things that people don't notice that are really really cool.
Interesting. You got any tips for people that want to learn more on that, like where they should go to learn more on just UX stuff? Because I know we've talked about it a few times, and I think you may have shared a couple. But if you got any, just like a quick set of resources or things that you would recommend people go look
Hmm.
at for game design stuff, or like learning the Nintendo tricks and that kind of stuff. Are there any like GDC talks or anything like that, or something else you'd recommend?
There's a lot of stuff. Like, so my YouTube channel has some videos specifically on design that I tend to kind of curate. Um, in general, though, I just find it's just the problem I find is people look for game resources. They specifically say game menu, game UI, but it's not game stuff. It's UI and UX, right? So
Mm.
I find there's actually a lot of resources, but you have to make sure that you're looking to learn what you're trying to learn. So in the case of building engaging UIs, the UI design principles is one thing, and there's a whole load of tech videos and various different. Like I think there's an entire channel that has tons and tons of them. Let me see if I can pull it up. Um,
Too much is not good though. Right? Like, you want to find just the good ones.
well, that is true. Yeah,
Right.
that's why, like I said, I'm without plugging my own channel stuff, but I do
Yeah.
keep that entirely there. If something really resonated with me, I'll put it onto my own playlists.
And
So there's a
that's
whole load
usually
of
where I
stuff there.
recommend people go to. I go look at his
Mm.
playlist there. He's got lots of stuff on game design, but I figure there's probably a couple others that I don't know, or that you highly recommend even off of that list. You think are the
Uh,
best ones?
yeah, let me even pull that up again to remember which ones in particular were valuable. But
You want
I
to
guess my
screen share
point
it real
is,
quick?
sure.
Pop
Um,
that thing up, and we can just show everybody, so that way they're not guessing,
it's probably a good
and that
idea.
way they
Yeah.
have a
Okay.
reason to watch the video, right? Instead of just listen. Hop on
I
over,
see.
take a look at our pretty faces and my amazing new haircut. First time I had a haircut in a long time. It feels really, really weird being short haired again and not having a beard. I don't know what to think.
Well, one of the jokes is that I've been
Hopefully
stealing
nobody
your beard slowly,
unsubscribed.
which I liked.
What's that?
One of the jokes was that I'm stealing your beard slowly. So
I
just
think you
taking the
might.
power.
Oh, that's what happened. Ah, my beard is
All right.
gone. Been robbed. All
So,
right, you ready for it?
yeah, why
Tell me
not? I'll see
when.
if I can pull up my. Where the hell are my playlists? Ugh.
Navigating the YouTube UI.
Yeah, I don't do this very often. Let me see playlists.
There you are.
Music. UI. Here we go. All right. So here's a few that I particularly like. I don't know if that's sharing or not.
Yeah, it's up.
Okay, well, just as a side note, because I redesigned my office earlier, I only have one monitor plugged in, so everything is in the one the one display.
Oh,
So if you want to learn sort of the business side of UI and design, there's this channel called The Future, which is really good. And they're very much like a marketing and design firm, and they'll go through sort of a lot of the detailed business side of choosing good fonts and how to design engaging marketing and that kind of stuff. That's really interesting from a general sort of I guess it's aimed towards teaching graphic designers. So you can imagine the kind of information that's sort of selling yourself as marketing is very interesting. It may not be relevant to what you think you need to know as a programmer, but like think about it. If you can learn the stuff that is being taught to designers, you're going to be better at designing, right? And so a lot of this stuff about brand identity and portfolio design, the difference between UI and UX, I find this channel is particularly good for that. Then if we go back,
I think that'd be really useful for like indie and solo developers, I would think, right? Like who are making their own game and trying to make it, market it, and come up with that whole brand identity where they need to have things kind of be cohesive and get it out there. Okay.
yeah.
Or
And
also
then
probably for like, sorry to interrupt you again, but like
no, go ahead.
thinking like doing 2D design in your game too, right? Like the UI design, the art and stuff. And you're probably not going to be doing a lot of that if you're on a big team, but if you're solo or you're putting together the initial versions of it, you might be doing that. Or on a smaller team, you might do that as a programmer too, at least until an artist hops in. Or you might just be an artist watching and want to learn this stuff, or a designer.
And again, I do think honestly, it's worth it for everybody. Like it really does feel like a skill that I think, like spending a few hours to learn the fundamentals of UI and UX will like help you in every facet.
Oh yeah.
This one is a great video. It's one of my favorites for kind of explaining clarity in design. So you'll see here, there's like a mock-up of what's basically a sort of like a to-do mail application. And you may not instinctively know why this feels off, but it does feel off. It's like you wouldn't like to be using this on a regular basis. But if you kind of jump to near the end where they have a redesigned version of it, where is it? The sort of instinctively, this feels better. And he goes through the details and the rules about why that's the case, but the short answer is it's discrete areas and information's been highlighted by weight. So you can kind of tell one of the biggest problems that people do with bad UIs is everything is weighed equally. And so it's very hard for you to gauge where to look because you don't know what's important. But if you have these like structurally, this is very clearly the most important thing, after that you've got this is more important, or this, depending on what you're looking for. And then the colors of the buttons indicate engagement actions and call to actions for certain pages. And it's a whole, this is a very good idea for designing where someone's eyes should be relative to a page you're designing. Then one that's really good for game developers especially is this one. How I organize colors for UI design, from learnsketch.com. So one problem that a lot of designers have, or I guess programmers I should say, is how do I choose what colors to use? And so the short cheat answer is to find a whole load of swatch and palette websites and go through those. And that works. That's a good way to do it. But if you ever kind of structure around, I want to design my own colors, I don't want to just take a palette or take someone else's swatch set, this will kind of explain how you pick colors. So the idea is you start with whatever colors you want, your basic brand colors that you want to begin with. And then how do you pick the variants? So a problem that people have is, what if I want a light and dark mode section? What if I want highlights and low lights for different stuff? Well, this shows you how to generate the subsequent colors for both sides that match across multiple different patterns and UIs. So that one's great. Then all of the stuff we've talked about in terms of the animations for sliding in and out, that's not UI design. That tends to be UX motion. So it really depends. If you want to look for specifically UX motion or motion design, that's a whole different category. But that's all the details around this stuff, where you're talking about these little engaging micro interactions where stuff is like more fun to move around and like these little icons that are changing and that kind of thing. So that's really worth learning as well. And again, there's rules for these, like min and max numbers. You shouldn't be taking too long for this based on people's perception of how long something takes. This one's really good. And then if you, all of that aside, if all of this stuff is just too, I'm not a designer, Jason. I don't want to be becoming a designer. This is too much information. Just this one alone, The Science of Great UI, this will get you to the point where your UIs just won't look bad. This one is just a nice, straightforward, just fundamentals of don't do this, and it'll look better. So if you just want a 20-minute like primer, the Science of Great UI from Coding Tech is great. And Coding Tech as a website or as a channel is fantastic. There's tons and tons. It's kind of like, I always recommend GDC and Unite Talks. Well, this is like that for just tech in general, just general principles of all of that. And in fact, I should probably save that to the UI and UX playlist. There we go.
Nice. There's another one for people to go watch in there. Yeah, I'm gonna go watch that one. I don't think I've seen that.
Yeah, it's great. It's like he uses a really simple example of superheroes and stuff, and he has sort of like a why is this grid hard to read? Well, the weight is identical. The lines have equal weight to the text, which is weird. And as you start to go through it, you realize, oh, hang on a second. Intuitively, suddenly, this like how much easier is it to start reading as you start moving the emphasis and changing the focus, and it's like it just teaches you the subtleties of what is the language you're using for your design, because a lot of people don't realize that you're actually saying something with the decisions you make. So these lines are an indication of weight of importance of information, and same with the colors and the other stuff. And so just the information alone isn't enough, and that gets into the differences between. There's a reason why you have your data is just raw. There's nothing to it, and then you have markup language, which indicates which sections represent what. So this is headers, this is paragraph, this whatever. And then on top of that, you've got the whole hypertext thing, which is these are links to other pages and other data. And then on top of that, you end up with style sheets, which takes those markers and then style them. So there's a reason why, as software has evolved, they've split it up into these individual sections. So each one has its own rules and concerns and problems. So it's a very big topic, I'll put it that way. So yeah, that's my channel in general, is just my name. So if you want YouTube, Jason Story. And under playlists, I just keep various playlists of stuff. Photoshop tutorials, music, headphone stuff, film and television essays, gaming essays, just general information I think is valuable. Cool, just interesting videos. Like one I found quite nice is explaining how the health bar works in Mario. It's a lot more complicated than you think it is, but it's a very fascinating video. It kind of teaches you about memory management and how it works older consoles. So there you go. That's your primer. Let's see, where's my exit on this?
It seems like a good place to get started for anybody that's into UI stuff. And I think it's definitely, like you said, everybody should do some and kind of spend at least some time learning UI stuff. I remember one of the best conferences I ever went to, I think I've talked about this before, was one of a code conference that was not really about game stuff, and most of it was totally irrelevant and not very useful. But there was at the beginning a workshop on UI and UX design by Billy Hollis, and it was like the best 6 to 8 hours that I've ever spent, like sitting learning, like in one session, just learning how to design UIs, how to write them, like how to mock them up, how to think of different ideas with them, and not just like redesign Word every time or redesign Outlook every time that I was designing a UI, or redesign, basically not just copy things and come up with different ways to randomize and mix it up. I mean, they're like cutting out shapes and laying out UIs and drawing all these things. And I really kind of that day picked up the habit of drawing all my UIs by hand first before I try to put them into game, long before, and drawing, never drawing just one. So if it's something that's real, I always draw it minimum 2, usually like 3 or 4 different versions of it. Most of the time, while I'm drawing them, I'm pretty sure that one of them is the right one and the others are all terrible and not the right idea. But almost always, I at least take something from one of them. Sometimes I'm wrong, though, and the ideas that I think were not really going to work just kind of work. I'll just try random crazy stuff. Like, let's try flipping the whole thing around, changing it, make the buttons all weird, and do all kinds of different crap and see what happens. And it was great. Best learning experience for me.
I find whether you're doing designing for UI stuff or starting projects or designing levels, there's a couple of principal rules that apply across the board. And the first one is that I find whenever you're trying to solve a problem, oftentimes there's some parts which are immutable and kind of the goal, and everything else is sort of like fancy design stuff afterwards. So a good example of this, if you're making a piece of software that's designed to solve a problem, like this is a to-do list application, The feature list is be able to make a to-do, be able to read my to-dos, be able to mark one as read or whatever. And then all the design stuff flows down from that. They're the things that are changeable, but as long as it supports the original rules, you're fine. Same with levels. A good level design isn't just arbitrary shapes. It is like, I have an objective. I need to get that key, open that door, kill that boss, reach the top of the tower. There's some goal, and then everything else feeds into that, and you can kind of flow your design from there. And so I usually start with that. I usually start the first thing going, why am I even here? What is the point of this screen? And that I would say, okay, what would I as a user want to do? If this screen is about managing my inventory, I want to add an item to my inventory. I want to remove items from my inventory. And I will start building the use cases and user stories from that. And then once I know what they are, the trick I find for designing good UIs is, what is the minimalist UI you could make that conforms to that specification? So if I want to add items to my inventory, I need like some way to view it and a button. That's it. And if I make that work and it makes it satisfying to use, I can then start doing all the stuff you're describing, play with the sizes and shapes and positions and stuff. But first things first is understanding, is the use case the right use case for what I'm solving? Because what I find a lot of UI does wrong is they don't really stop and think, why is someone opening this screen? Like, because you might think, I'll put UI because I'll show players health and ammo and whatever else. And it's like, but if you stopped and said, why would people look at the UI? They'll look at it if they're low on ammo. So maybe that should be important in size. The names of the guns, are they going to be looking at the names of the guns often? Or is that something that they might be curious about? But the important thing is how much ammo is in the gun or whatever. So if you reason about the order of importance of the information you're displaying, you'll find that even a badly designed UI will functionally be better because it'll actually help support the use cases the person has.
Wait, what? You lost me on that last sentence.
So if it's designed badly, if you've made sure that the actual,
you mean if it's just ugly?
Yeah. So what I'm saying is, like, if you know the point of this screen is to show this piece of information, and as long as that piece of information is on the screen, the rest of it you can kind of. But what sometimes people do is they don't actually know what the point of the screen is. So what piece of information is important, and so the actual valuable info is buried inside of the other stuff, and that's what makes a bad UI. But if the very first thing, important piece, is the actual reason this screen exists, everything else, like, obviously should be nicer, but it can be ugly as long as functionally I can use it efficiently to solve the problem I have as a user.
Right. That makes sense. Yeah. I thought you were saying it would still be good, but no, you're saying the design part is good, having the key data there, even if it's ugly. But yeah, no, that makes sense. And I kind of didn't mention that. I was trying to grab one of my papers that showed this, but apparently I've lost those notebooks and mixed them up with other ones that are just full of words. Totally boring, not fun to show me, like a bunch of me writing words. But when they're doing those, one of the other things that I like to do, and it kind of aligns with what you're saying, is also like cut out pieces and move them around on the UI. So like I'll make like an item, cut it out. Like, okay, so if I want to like take items from one spot to another, what is that process like? And I can do it all just like with a little piece of paper. I don't even have to draw like an item. I can draw a sword and it's a line and a line, and I'm done. I got my UI there, and I can see like kind of like how I want to do that interaction. And I think essentially, I guess I didn't think of the wording for it, but essentially to do the same thing that you were talking about, to make sure that the UI is showing and representing the important parts, and that the important parts are what's highlighted, and that the use makes sense. So that you don't have this UI and like, oh yeah, but I also need to get another window, drag a thing from that window, drag it over to here, and like, get to know all of this hidden stuff. Or here's the UI, and you have to hold control and right click to make this thing work. There's a little note on the bottom, like, avoid all that.
I think I've actually told this story before, but it's like, a lot of this stuff I'm saying comes from personal experience of screwing up and being told I screwed up, or learning afterwards I did. And so to give a real practical example of what I mean by this is, at one stage I worked at a company that made scanners. Those like product scanners that blip your like at a supermarket and you scan products and whatever.
Like the red line ones?
Yeah, the little red line barcode scanners. And so, because a little fun fact too is there's you can actually get Android-based barcode scanners where all of the hardware is pre-built for you, and the trigger button just fires a command that copies it to the clipboard. So you can write software that reads the clipboard, and it's like a really easy way to make your own software for barcode scanning tools. But we did one of those, And the point of it was we had this big database of products, and you would scan the products and scan the labels for them, and the products would automatically appear on the label. You wouldn't have to write labels and stick them everywhere, and it would save a ton of time, because what they would do is say this row has this label to this product, this label to this product, and you just scan, and it was really cool. And it also meant if there was like a price,
labels like on the shelf there.
Yeah, those are
like digital labels on the shelves, right?
Digital e-ink displays, yeah, and they would connect. So what you'd do is you'd stack them on the shelves, and you'd scan the bread or whatever, and you'd mark it, and you'd turn the label and scan it, and that would then be tied to that product. It would basically scan the barcode, look at the product ID, scan the ID for the actual label, tie them together, and then just connect them. Anyway, that's kind of irrelevant. My point was, in order to set this up for a brand new store, you would have an army of 10 people who would go to a store, and the store doesn't want to have downtime. They don't want to be like offline while a bunch of people run around and replace their labels with digital labels and scan every product in the store at least once, right? So what they do is they get up like super early in the morning, 4 or 5 a.m. or something, before the store is even open, and they just run around and try to do it. And part of the package of selling this to people is to say, we'll do this in under 2 hours. We will send a whole team in, and we'll get this whole thing set up in under 2 hours, so you'll never have to worry about like printing out these little labels and sticking them around anymore. And so I wrote that software, and I put it on the device, and I gave it to everybody. And it used to take them whatever, an hour or two to do this. And the way they did it was they'd pick up either the product or the label, they'd scan it, it would say scan the other one, and you'd scan the other one, and I'd have a little message on the screen that says congratulations, connected, and all that stuff. Now, here's something that I didn't realize. Now, I made it really nice, I'll be honest. I went and learned a whole load of stuff about UI and swishy animations, and so almost in exactly as we're describing, it was really nice looking. But from a usability standpoint, as soon as you scanned both items, you would have to take your hand off of the object and tap the screen to say okay, to accept the message that I had popped up as a friendly, it has now synchronized both things. Now, that sounds fine. When I design it in a vacuum, it's a perfectly fine little press OK, it's done. And it looks nice. It's a nice little tick animation, yeah. But when they're using it, their hand is on a trigger switch for the barcode scanner, and that doesn't activate the button. And so every time they're going blip, 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 blip. And so someone brought that up to me, and it says, oh, I never thought about that. So I just like a single line of code, I commented it out. And it took the time down from like 2 hours to an hour to do that same job, because people weren't having to stop and hit this checkbox. And so that's what I mean when I say that I didn't take the use case into account. I didn't put myself in the mindset of somebody walking shelf to shelf, scanning all these products, racing to do it all before the store opens. I instead looked at what would be a nice shiny UI. And so that life lesson sort of really stuck with me is, I should design my UIs around what is someone trying to do first, and then how do I make that shiny without getting in the way of the objectives?
That's great. I've done many things like that in the past. Try to make it nice and pretty and fancy, just made it harder to use, and it didn't work out well. I think of one meeting that I had that was 2 weeks long. So we had this 2 week long meeting with a bunch of executives. This was at a big corporation, all on this big project to do basically to automate and make somebody's job easier. Somebody that was going around testing phones, right? They're doing some testing of new phones way before they come out, make sure that it's easier. Try to like, what can we do to simplify this job? And they have this whole plan drawn up of like, we're going to build this system where they go in these carts and they can just walk it through these important places, push it right through the mall or whatever, and test everything, make sure that everything's good. 2 weeks into the meeting, they're like, one of the guys comes who's actually going to be using it. Like, yeah, this would make things way harder. Right now, we just pop it in our backpack and we're done. Like none of this, like all of this is just going to make things harder. We don't need this. Like kind of meeting that you need to have early on, I guess. So I was just glad, like that was one where at the time I was like, wow, this was a disaster. But then I realized later on, like that meeting saved probably millions of dollars, right? That meeting that I thought was like a waste of time and a disaster to go over the use case and really evaluate everything just saved the company millions, and not building something that wasn't going to be necessary. And I mean, like I said, the time savings alone from these little things can be huge. I've done it at much smaller scales too. That one just fucking blew me away. It's like, wow. Like,
yeah, and I've seen the same things. Yeah.
Project that nobody wanted just because of miscommunication.
I saw something similar with VR where people were like, they were trying to say VR was the new hot everything. Everyone had to be VR. And I remember one group had the idea that we can use VR for data analysis. So all of these people whose jobs are to look at seas of Excel spreadsheets and find relationships between data, couldn't we find a way to visually represent that in 3D? That would be really cool. We have an entire extra axis of information to work with. And it's like, that sounds really cool. And they started designing out stuff, and they're like, yeah, you could do this, and then this would be like, you could have a group of birds flying around the tree, and the number of birds represents how much stuff is on this relative to that. So you'd get like this conceptual data. And all of this sounds really cool, and I really like enjoyed working on it. But at some stage, I kind of stopped and went, have you ever asked somebody who does this for a living if they would use this? And it's like, what do you mean? It's like, well, because at the end of the day, this is somebody's day job, and this is one of those things that you don't appreciate as a designer or as a developer. That like somebody gets up in the morning, sits down at a desk, and they use whatever software you're making. That's the goal, right? Someone uses the thing you make, and what they're trying to do is the paramount important thing. And so after talking to somebody who would use something like this, they're like, no, I just shortcuts. It's fast. I can read. I've been working with spreadsheets for the last 10 years. I mean, conceptualizing is big trees and things is cool sounding, but like that's not, if I want to get work done, I won't do it that way. I'm not going to put on a VR headset and go through all this stuff. And it's like, it really struck me as that, again, complete disconnect between
drag them around.
Yeah, and people are like that, but it sounds really cool. It would look really visual and yeah, but like my job is to get it done efficiently. My job isn't to like run around the matrix. And everybody wants to be in Minority Report. It looks cool, but like that's not the point, right? If you want to get work done, you get work done. And so it's really interesting how there's like a huge disconnect between what would be a cool design versus what actually needs to get done. And so yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of that too, just in VR especially, where everybody wanted to do everything in VR. And some stuff makes sense. Some things like being able to see them and see the stuff there makes sense. But visualizing like actual data, I've never come across a scenario where I was able to like better comprehend the data because of a 3D visualization. Because I feel like there's just too, I mean, not one that I couldn't do just in 3D on a screen in a browser.
I've had one. The one time that it was easier was we were doing geographical data, and it's much easier to invert a sphere and place a world map on the inverted sphere and put the data points on the inside, and you can look around and actually see the world map in a way that's far faster. That one actively did make it easier and faster to engage with like census data and that kind of stuff. That one worked quite well, but yeah, on average, it usually, especially if it's like representing spreadsheets, it just doesn't work.
Right. And that one, still, you're representing something real. Like you're representing the world and actual space where you're getting it. A lot of the ones that I've seen, it's trying to like visualize, represent data kind of like in the way that you were saying, with birds meaning something else and other things meaning things, and bars that are all different sizes and different colors meaning things. And it's, while it's cool, and not the most productive or an easy way to work. And on that topic, one of the things I learned doing a lot of tools development was that the best thing you can do with your time is watch people use your stuff, especially no matter what it is, like playing a game, or if you're building a game, watching them play your game. It's super, super important, super valuable. But when you're building tools and applications and stuff, especially I was doing a lot of game tools. My best and most useful thing would be to watch the game designers actually use my tools, because I'd see what they would do, and almost every time I would notice something that I could, like, where there'd be an easy change I could make that would save them an hour a day. I'd be like, okay, they're doing this repeated manual process real quick. Like, I can make that a hotkey and save 5 minutes off of every time that they do this, so that they're not manually doing this. You're doing it,
I actually used to do that at the bank. I would literally make a point of asking everybody, because I was a graduate, I was new, and I wanted a quick excuse to sort of see what everyone was doing. So I said, hey, look, I'm new, I've done what I'm doing. Can I just like shadow you for 30 minutes? I'm just curious what your job is, how it works. I want to know it. And what I was really doing is I was trying to keep an eye on how they do their job to find out where the time sinks are, so that I could give them a piece of software and go, hey, by the way, I just noticed you were doing this, thought this would be easier. I thought it would be a great way to be an in with everybody to sort of make their job easier. And so I did exactly that. I went by and I was like, I noticed some people were using Active Directory, and they would open up the Active Directory tool and do a search and find all this stuff. And I'm like, the information they're really looking for is finding the department of somebody based on their email address. So what if I just made a front end that let them type a name, did a fuzzy search, found the email, find the thing, and just says, this person is in this department. And it's like, I've just saved somebody X number of minutes or hours per day on each of their work. And it's like, it's just a satisfying thing to do. And it's very, as you said, it's very easy. As a developer, you realize that like people don't think about what can be optimized, because it's not in their, if they know they can't do it, they don't realize it's like it would only take an hour, or maybe even worst case a week of a developer's time to write a couple of quick scripts to do something small, but that could fundamentally make their lives easier. So yeah, I always try to do it to kind of bridge that gap by like asking them, well, why are you doing it that way? It says, oh, well, I'm clicking this because it does this and whatever. It's like, well, wouldn't it be easier if I could do this? I said, yeah, of course it would be easier. I said, give me a second. We'll be back and I'll make something.
The other one that I found too, like, because saving time with new things is good, but I've also noticed that I'll catch them like working around bugs that I didn't know existed. So I'll like given them a tool, or they'll have some tool that already existed that they've been using, and I'll find that they're doing some really strange process. Like every time they save, they do a file save as, and they copy a thing. I'm like, why do you do that? Oh, because sometimes when we save, the whole thing crashes and blows up. So we only ever use save as. Nobody ever hit save or whatever. It was random weird things like that. And I'm like, oh, had I known that, I can fix it. So I'm gonna go fix that right now. Like, can you show me that? Reproduce that. Let me see how that crashes. I want to fix it. And then you go fix it and solve a bunch of problems. A lot of the time, what happens is like people will run into the problem, they'll see the bug, they'll report the bug to somebody. That somebody won't really think of it as the most important thing. It's maybe there's something else that's more important on their list. They forget about it. Nobody else thinks about it, and then the people using the tool just think like, oh, it's just something we can't get fixed. Like they can't do it. We told them about it. They can't do it. Really, like the people who probably could have fixed it and can fix it just don't realize it's happening. 90% of the time, that's the case. It's a developers don't realize because they missed the communication, they screwed up or whatever.
I have a literal perfect example of exactly what you're talking about. I was working at a company where I was onboarded onto an old project. And the old project was data entry. They would take forms from people, read the forms, and they would start typing the data in. And that would be most of the time. It would just be like literally someone at a desk, and they'd give them information. They'd read from a sheet and they'd type it in. But sometimes the person would give them documents in advance. They would say, oh, by the way, here's a document. You can just copy and paste the info instead of typing it yourself. And I remember asking somebody, and what they were doing was they would copy the text from a document given to them, paste it into Notepad, then copy it from Notepad and paste it into our application. And I was like, what are you doing? Why is that a thing? They said, oh, well, if you paste it directly in, it crashes. I'm like, what? If you paste the text directly in, it crashes. I'm like, I don't understand. And so I looked into this and I found out that what happens is we were using some third-party library for the what you see is what you get editor, text boxes, and components. And it didn't have support for a lot of the formatting tags. So if you copied it from something that was like a Word document, all of the hidden tag data for headers and all the other stuff was adding like brackets and things that were crashing our system because the parser was expecting plain text, didn't support interesting characters. And so the general consensus for the company, for all these people years before I got there, was, oh yeah, you just don't paste directly in. The solution is you paste to a text file that does magic, which in this case strips the other tags, and then paste it back in, and it works. And it blew my mind. It's like, this isn't even something that was like a random thing somebody did. This was in the PowerPoint presentations. They would teach people who are new to the company of, here is how you do this. If you get a document, you paste it to a text file, then you paste it back over. And it was exactly what you're describing. It's insane because nobody ever stopped and went, I could fix this. This is like, let me just like write a line of code to strip out the characters, you know?
Yeah. That's awesome. Wow. It's just crashing it. I can totally see it too. I can just parsing and blows up. I've got an early tip, by the way, on pasting. So for anybody who does a lot of pasting and is still doing that, where you're pasting into Notepad, when you're holding Control and hitting V, if you hold Shift as well, it does the paste without formatting. It just rips out the formatting. It probably wouldn't work in your application specifically. I don't know. Maybe if it was a Chrome app, it would have worked, right? But anywhere else, yeah, like Control Shift V. I use it all the time to paste things without formatting. Otherwise, I end up with links and everything else in my text. That's wow. That's a fun one. Totally.
And what was funny is if they did do it, what happens is there was a row in a database table somewhere that had a state. And that was like, so basically, without going to the whole thing, this was a business process management tool. So it effectively moved validation states through steps to be validated and signed off by people and all that stuff. And so there was a flag field that was like, we are in this state. It is processing. It has been validated 1, validated by 2, validate whatever.
Mhm.
And if it did break because of this, it would get stuck in an intermediary state where the old state would exit, the new state wouldn't enter, and it would just disappear from the system. So the lists that would normally show all of the documents, this document would just blip out of existence. And the only way to fix it was to call up the guy who was sitting at his desk doing that job to open the database and type in the name of like processing as the state into that field, into that table. So not only was it a ridiculous waste of time from a bug from fixing it, the universal company standard is, oh, if it goes wrong, call this guy. And this guy and honestly, because it was a big company with lots of people, he'd get phone calls like whatever, 20 a day that were just his part of his job was copy and paste a word into the table to push a state column to another table because the automatic system wasn't picking it up because the word still said processing instead of, next phase or whatever. So this stuff happens.
That's scary stuff, man. I mean, I've seen it before, but it's scary when systems are like that, and it's also a scary position to be in, like having that job, because like that job is one that, or at least that portion of that job is one that shouldn't exist, right? It's a
Yeah,
job
you
that
should
like
not be interacting with a production database like that. That is
no,
nonsense. Yeah.
you don't want to have to do that. I've had cases where we had to go in and like make changes in the database, and it's scary and dangerous, and you mess up, you can do really, really bad things. Wow, yeah, that's yeah. So I was gonna tell you another story that I had. What was it? I've totally lost it now. It was really good and really interesting and really funny, but I've totally spaced on what it is. Maybe if enough people hit the like button, I'll remember. I don't know. What was I gonna tell you about? I don't know. I've lost it. If it pops back in, I'll tell you.
Well, one thing I might as well answer one because I think it's an interesting topic. So you've probably gotten a lot of questions too about MVC or MVP or MVVM or all the others. And I find let's just sidestep the should you use it in Unity and when question. And let's instead talk about what it is and why it exists and what it does. Because I think that's a whole separate conversation. And I think if you ask 90% of developers what's the difference between MVC and MVP, they couldn't really tell you.
Right.
So yeah, I guess I'll start there. So I'll say, in any application, you tend to have 3 parts. It's called 3-tiered architecture, and that means there's some stuff. In our example, there's some data, to reuse a word we've used all day. Some stuff. Then there's some place it goes, like a screen, and then somewhere in the middle, stuff goes to screen. So that's your 3 kind of basic layers. Now, back in ye olden days of early web, back when CERN made the original, hypertext web, well, www, which by the way was originally an application, and it wasn't the name for the internet. The World Wide Web was an actual application's name, and then over time it became the name for the web, and the application got renamed to something else. But that concept basically is kind of predicated on this triple architecture. And so the way the web used to work is it originally started with hypertext, so the idea is that I have a document. It's got a bunch of people. It's like my favorite books and a list of my favorite books. That's not usually enough information. The information we'll need to have, I want to know more about the third book. How do I do that? So you have another document that is the name of that book and all the other information about it. And in a kind of, this was used originally by for science, right? You'd have a load of connected information, like this thing connects to this, which has these things, you need this equipment and this whatever. And so you need to connect all of this. And that was the term hyperlinks. So a hyperlink is a link to one document of data to another document of data. And that's kind of all that was there. And so the way you would interact with this is you'd have to have some UI that would take the data, show it, and you can interact with it and then do stuff with it. So you would basically take the data, put it through some control layer, and then view it. And the important difference is in MVC, the original sort of architecture style, you basically built a view and then threw it at the screen. So the example of this is a website. In the back end, you would take all of that data, you would go for each piece of data, create a header and create the body portions and style it this way and blah, blah, blah. And then you would deliver the website. And it was a single static web page that would arrive. And so that was the kind of MVC pattern. It was when you made views that were to be consumed as a single piece of data, and you would do a load of stuff with it. You'd press a button, and then that resulting view would package its changes and then send it back. And so it was really static and slow. And that's why old websites would literally reload the whole page every time you clicked a submit button. There's kind of a whole state and form. Now, that's what the web was designed for. It was designed for hypertext markup language, which was basically you have some data, you have hyperlinks in the data, and then you want to mark which parts of the data are lists or headers or whatever. So whatever rendering engine at the other end shows it can read through it, know nothing about where it came from, and go, oh, I draw headers this way, I draw text this way, and my screen size is this long, so I'll draw paragraphs to that length, and it will display your data. But as people did, they kind of got fancy with it, and they started doing things like embedding scripts and doing other fancy things, to the point where this idea of views don't really make much sense anymore, because people want real-time interaction with views where they can click stuff and stuff changes and interesting stuff happens. And so MVC wasn't really as valuable as it used to be. So it still works in some cases, and it works specifically in the case of an API. So if you ever used REST APIs or that kind of thing, you don't really think about it that way, but you're actually using an MVC pattern there, because what you're doing is your view is an API. It's like people/1, the first person, or book/5, the fifth book. That's your UI of it. And then it's using API controllers, and the controllers will parse your commands in, access the data, and then generate a view back, which happens to be JSON. That's the view type, and then throws the view back at you. So APIs use MVC as their pattern. But for actual UIs, the full side, that doesn't really work as well. You want interaction. So after that, you get yourself to MVP. And MVP changes from model, instead of being model, view, and controller, which, by the way, the order is confusing. It should really be model, controller, view. That's a whole different thing based on the order it's doing it in. Model view presenter is the new thing. And so the difference is a model view controller is like a thing that constructs the data and then creates a single static view. A presenter is like a live connection to that view. It's where you create a view, you constantly keep it active and up. And so the difference tends to be that you have a way of cross-talking, that if something changes on the view, it updates on the controller, which changes the data and sends it back. So an example of this would be like a list of items, and you can click one, and then it would show the item that you've selected. That's not really doable in a standard MVC original pattern, because you'd have to basically choose something, send it back. It would go back, create a new page, and send you back the new page, and whatever. So model view presenter is that, plus the ability to sort of talk and change discrete bits of information. And so that's great. I actually prefer that to the next one. That's my personal choice, because I think it's very declarative. But then you go one step further, and that's where you get into the kind of the Microsoft standard. And so the Microsoft standard would be, if you ever used WinForms or WPF or any of their other UI frame platforms, there's they use what's called MVVM, or model view model. So again, we're getting into silly names here, but if you forget about the actual names and just look at the reasoning why. The first one was static views. They were good enough. The second one was, okay, now we can talk back and forth, but we have to sort of like ask questions. Did they select a button? Yes or no? Okay, they did. Give me the information back. I'll make a decision. I'll send it back to you. The difference between those and view models is you put another layer in the middle, where what you do is you take the data and then you wrap it in a box where the data's got events attached to it. So these are usually called notifications or notification changes or some version of that. And so what you have is a person is just an email address. A person model is a name and an email address with notification changed events for when either value has changed. And then what you do is you bind that model to the view. So rather than actually having a controller which makes decisions, you hand it the object, and the view has real-time connection to the data changing. So if either the backend changes or the front end changes the data changes, which changes the event, and sort of it's like passively connected. And so they call this binding, and there's like single directional binding or bidirectional binding, but it effectively means that the data itself is like a wrapped version of the data that like explains the connections between them. So summarize all of that. There's your three common patterns. You've got MVC, which is just let me construct some presentation of this information and throw it at you. You could consider
creating a PDF file is in a weird way falls into MVC. You have some data, you make some decisions about that data, and then you throw it out as a viewed form of that data in a nice, pretty presentation. Then MVP, which is the same kind of idea, only imagine if you click something on that PDF file, it would then go back, do some more logic, and then send you back just the bits that have changed, and now you've got a newer version of the display. It saves you having to like regenerate the whole thing every time. And then finally, MVVM is, rather than doing that combination with all three, I would say, I have this object, let me attach a bunch of events and stuff to it. So there's not really making decisions, it's just making it eventful. And then I hand that event to the UI. And the UI basically says, text box equals this piece of data, and this text box equals this piece of data, and this command is connected to this button. And so by the sheer properties of having changed the text, it will automatically change the data, which will then mean when you press the button, it'll automatically run the logic. So the last one's a bit harder. It requires you to kind of understand notification property change events, and there's actually a whole thing on that. But again, just take for granted that they all serve a purpose, and they're kind of increments on the same idea.
Right. Yeah, and that was a great introduction to them too, I think. A lot of people are curious about what to use in actual game development. Now, personally, I use, I guess, a bit of a mix between MVP and MVVM. There are definitely games and scenarios where I like to just bind up portions of my model directly up to the UI. It just is going to make the most sense. There's not a lot of need for a controller. There are other cases where I might need a controller or an actual presentation layer where I've got a good amount of stuff, more for UI-based games where it's less other stuff going on. In the games where I don't have a lot of input or like typing or just UI stuff in general, it's a little bit closer to the MVVM style usually, but one directional. So it's not really MVVM. It's just one directional part of it, of the binding directly of the objects, not so much the input binding.
I think if people are still confused about the example, a really good example of this would be if I have a grid of data. So like the example in the earlier image I showed with the UX stuff was superheroes and their power levels or something like that. If you use MVC, you will generate that table and you will send the table to view. If you use MVP, you will generate the table and send the table to view. But if I change a column on the table, there will be a line of code that says on cell changed. And I could say, if on cell changed, take this field, take the model, change the field in the model to this field. If you use MVVM, you hand it a view model of that table, and all changes will automatically change the data in the field, so you're not dealing with it separately. And then when you're done, you can take the resulting view model and then unpack it back into whatever data source you want. So the difference is whether you're responding to events in real time or you let the data object itself do all of the event data and then result in something afterwards.
There was a question in chat I was trying to find. I was going to scroll up and see if I could find it about flags. There's a whole lot of chat about it, and I just figured I would try to see if we could grab it and pop up and talk about it a little bit, because it seemed kind of technical, but I've totally lost it. I'm trying to find it. Sorry, scrolling up through here and can't find the thing now. Right there. Bam. Popped it up. So, is there a pattern to handle a bunch of bool checks for a point-and-click adventure games? What actions are where actions are conditional on something else happening? So essentially a flag system, right? There's a lot of talk about this down below, and there are a bunch of different ways to do this. I was kind of curious what your thoughts were on ways to do this. Like, I mean, I've got some that I share in the course, and some I've shared in lots of other videos. But say you've got a point and click adventure where you've just got a bunch of bools. So assuming that we're not doing anything, no other types of flags, just true and false checks only. Going to give a couple recommendations for ones that you would use or setups you would use.
Yeah, well, I guess to follow something you've talked a lot about in your course. And again, I like, keep in mind, information is always valuable to have. So just as a reminder, I've taken his course. I'm currently taking the most recent course, and so specifically the one you talked about most recently was the flags for dealing with the door stuff. And I would, just like you were saying, I would start with the dictionary or something similar. It's just a straightforward. Here's some true and falses. Here's some labels for them. this will work. This will do what for verifying that have they got the key? Did they visit this place? Have they talked to this person? And until it needs to scale beyond that, that's usually fine to start.
And then for the key there, you're thinking, I would think there would be different things that you might want to use there for the key. So you could have, it could be a string that you're just checking somewhere in your code. Those are usually really brittle though. Like in my experience, problem with doing a string one is that like somebody renames something and then you don't realize that it's broken until way later. And then it causes other issues.
The name for that is stringly typed. So there's strongly typed and then there's stringly typed. And stringly typed means that if someone misspells it, you're basically, your architecture falls apart.
Pretty much, yeah. It can be dangerous. Another option would be using like enum or enumerations. Those can work relatively well. They do require code changes every time. And then the other option would be like to have an actual prefab or something as the key, I guess.
Yeah, once you get into the bigger territories, I usually fall into like, they call it a rule engine. And so if you're doing anything that's got a good example of this, because I had a conversation with somebody in one of the Discords about card games. So say you've got, you're making Magic the Gathering or Yu-Gi-Oh or whatever, and you're basically saying this card executes a series of rules. How do you do the logic for that? Because they've got tons of stuff going on. Well, the general name for that is called a rule engine. And a rule engine is basically the only thing you can say for certain is you've got something called predicates or yes or no's, and then you've got commands or actions, something that happens. And so rather than trying to solve the answer by hard coding the answers to each question, you make these sorts of rules saying, if they have this and this card is played and we're on this map and the health is greater than this, perform these actions, and then if you play that actions, do whatever. And so you construct these rules that can be easy to change, and then you sort of execute the rule engine by parsing the rule that you've made. So once you start getting beyond the basics of straightforward key and lock combinations, you're going to need something that says, defines the rules out. And if you want to get a good example of this, it's Inky, just like you're using. That's a rule engine, right? You're defining the rules of navigation through a tree of dialogue, where at these things, these events fire. And that way you're not writing the code for the use cases of doors and keys. You're writing the rules of the conversation that evaluate to events and that kind of thing.
That makes sense. So I don't know that it would necessarily apply at this level, but when you get to the bigger stuff, having that set up.
Yeah, that's why I start with dictionaries, because dictionaries will be fine for here, I think.
Yeah, I think at this point you're good with dictionaries because it's just bools and the checks. But yeah, once you get to the bigger stuff, something that's a little bit more advanced to handle that logic is usually really important. I like to build out some sort of conditional checking systems, or even just visual scripting setup, depending on what the game is. Just adding visual scripting may be enough with a couple little components to deal with it. But for this, yeah, like just having a dictionary, great simple option. Especially if you're just reading text, and you're going to be able to match it. But the thing that I like to do now, and we're actually going through this in the course, is setting up flags as scriptable objects, because then you can just reference them. You can reference them in multiple spots. You can just reference them in a Unity event or from any game object and just check against it. Depends a lot on how your game's set up, though. A point and click adventure, maybe, to be honest, it might be really easy to do it with a point and click adventure, because it's probably just game objects that you're referencing. You just have a reference to the flag that they need to check to see whether or not they're on or off, or they're interactable or not, and they can just literally read that flag. You can check the bool state of that flag, whether it's true or false, and it'll kind of automatically work. Like there's not a lot to it, and then persisting those out is relatively simple as well. It's actually one of the things that I'm working on is the videos for that. I've got them all set up for tomorrow. Going over more flag stuff and then the persistent stuff to actually save those flags out and stuff. You still there, Jason? You look like you have frozen up and disappeared for a second. I minimized the wrong Jason. There we go. I give him a second to pop back up and come back. Anyway, thanks for the super chat. It was a great conversation until Jason just decided to poof and disappear on me. But yeah, anyway, for flags, I try scriptable objects, but dictionary is definitely the simplest and quickest solution if you just wanted to quickly check, whether or not something is true or false, or whether or not, a large list of things are true or false. But with a scriptable object, you can just make a folder of them, go back in, and then drop them in and add in as many as you want, or allow your designers to do it, which is kind of the biggest benefit, is that you can make the change without having to do any code. Your designers can just go in, right click, add in a new flag, and then hook it up to whatever you want. And you can probably teach them how to do that in 10 minutes. Or if you have to teach them how to add an enum or how to match string names or anything else, it gets to be a lot harder. You still have to worry about them like breaking references on stuff, but outside of that, it's definitely an easier one.
Do you mean, because you haven't got that far in the course, so I'm curious if the intention is to go towards a scriptable object with an array of conditions and an array of commands that fire, or is it just each flag is a scriptable object?
So each flag is its own scriptable object, but then there's a manager handling those to find and trigger them and check against them. And then they could also just be directly referenced. So you can have ways to check them from systems that can't reference them directly. If the thing, like for instance, like Inky, ink dialogue, for anybody that's not familiar, it's just like text file you can go through and write some dialogue with. That can't reference a scriptable object because it's a text file. So in those cases, it's going through a management system that's also dealing with loading and saving there we go. Loading and saving those two. Got my 2 fingers there. The loading and saving of the flags as well for multiple games. So you can have like game 1, game 2, or whatever, and then persist that off, load it all up. So yeah, I've lost my train of thought there, but
yeah, I definitely I use it a lot for setting stuff. Like I find at the end of the day, flags are kind of a form of settings. It's just you're flagging something as being on or off or true or false. And so I will often use scriptable objects if multiple objects need to share the same settings. A common one for that would be if you have, I think you've mentioned already before, the flyweight pattern, where you have a bunch of parameters for healths and levels and stuff, and you just want to have one thing shared across all of them, like a door animation speed. You don't want to have to go into each and every prefab. You could have multiple prefabs at unique door settings, but if 99.9% of doors are going to swing open with a certain sound effect and do something, you can just put a scriptable object with the sound effect and the speed, and then every door reads that, and then you've got one place you can live edit it anywhere that'll affect all of the doors, or that kind of thing.
Yeah. That's another great use for scriptable objects too. For anybody that doesn't use them that way, like having global settings or just multiple settings, and then you can build custom editors on top of it, or just use the default inspectors, and it kind of works and makes it easy to adjust those. Because you're right, if you've got 100 doors in your game across a bunch of scenes, you really don't want to go change the door sound on all of them. So if you're not doing things like that, you just won't do it. You won't make the change, right? You'll be like, oh yeah, the door sounds like that. Like we could change them, but do we want to waste a day? The answer is no.
Yeah, and prefabs are great for sure, you can have a prefab and prefab the doors and change those. But say you've got like an enemy, and the enemy is like there's 10 enemies and they're all of the same type, and then they all have to target somebody new. Or there's like 2 teams and they're all like looking to target different things. Wouldn't it be so much easier to have one scriptable object and say, this is the target you're all pooling from, rather than for each enemy, here's your target, here's your target, here's your target. So the difference comes down to your use case. If it's something that can be just set and sort of like configured, prefabs will be fine. But if it's something where you're going to be live messing with those data, it's quite nice to have a single, like to the event system you've got, of course, where you're doing the when I hit this button, it fires the event without having to actually like run a device. It's just a separate unit of work, which has its own pros and cons, but is really valuable for exactly that, for testing doors open and cameras moving to the right and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it comes in really handy for just time saving and getting things done, being able to just pop in buttons or context menus on those things and make them activate and stuff. And scriptable objects, I think you kind of loosely mentioned that you can use them for just that sharing data across other game objects, right? You put in a target or a destination or whatever the thing is, and every object can just reference that scriptable object. And as you update the data there, it gets the update live while you're playing, right? And it doesn't save off automatically. So when you stop playing, you're gonna get it reset right back. You will have to deal with resetting it in the editor a little bit, but when you're actually playing your game, it's gonna reset when you reload the game. But if you just when you close,
and a fun fact too, there is a function that people don't really know about. You've got your starts, your awakes, your updates, your on trigger enters, whatever. There is one called reset, a function that is called whenever the reset is pressed on an object. So if you want to set a bunch of default properties on something like a scriptable object, you can just assign them all in reset. And so whenever you click the reset, it'll just auto assign those values to start.
Yeah. And the other thing you can use is, I think it was on disable to just fire code off at the end of it so that it'll just reset them back out to defaults or whatever too. Just auto call that if you want. But that's only really, I mean, it's more of an editor specific thing because once you do a build and you're actually running it, you don't have to worry about that data not reloading because it doesn't save on its own.
I will say the one thing I have seen people not doing, which I think is a way of really taking that scriptable object thing to the next level, is it's one thing having a scriptable object where the data changes. So for example, current target changes or whatever, and then all of the objects use the like targeting settings scriptable object. But you have to still update your script when that target changes. And so a lot of people will just have an update loop where it will just pull the current target from that scriptable object. But to kind of tie us back to the MVVM conversation we had before, there is an inbuilt interface called iNotifyPropertyChanged. And if you have your object implement the iNotifyPropertyChanged event handler, what you can do is you can make, instead of just using the fields, you make public properties and you reference the notification handler. And then what will happen is an action will get called whenever any of the values change, which means you don't have to sort of guess when that object is updated. You can effectively subscribe to the event and say, if the scriptable object changes elsewhere, get a single fired call, say this has changed, and I can now update my data relative.
Yeah, I remember using that property everywhere. That with Fody to weave it in to automate
Fody
a lot of that.
Weavers. Fody Weavers are the best. Yeah.
Yeah, it was fun stuff, and that was a really nice pattern. But it also made me get lazy with my data setup. So I'm like, I notify property changed. Everything's going to be magic. So there were two more questions that popped up. One was from Alex about the courses, and his wife is trying to convince him to take them. For the older stuff, do you still answer questions? Yeah, I still answer all the questions that come in. I try to answer stuff as soon as it comes in. Sometimes emails take me a little while, like that one that we talked about earlier on the stream. But most of the time, try to get to them right away. Even the old stuff, sometimes I get a little bit rusty on it. There was a question about scriptable objects, though, a super chat that came in. Would you use a scriptable object for surveys? And if so, how? In this case, maybe not. It depends. So if you're not doing too many surveys, you don't have a lot of data, and you don't need to have somebody else import or insert the data, then doing scriptable objects for the survey stuff would be fine. You could put a question, you could put some answers, and you could just fill it all out in the inspector. If you're going to be doing hundreds of these and you're going to need like other people inserting the data, or you're going to need people that aren't using Unity inserting the data, and it's just going to be a lot, I would consider going to something like even just Google Sheets for the data source and pulling that in instead. Maybe still using even some scriptable objects, probably just some prefabs though, filling in the data from Google Sheets. You can grab like a Google Sheets plugin from the asset store and use that. But to start, I would probably just, build it out with scriptable objects real quick, get 3 or 4 questions in there, get the structure kind of working, get it figured out. And then again, if you have to put a lot of stuff in there, you don't want to have people going in and doing builds and stuff. You want that data to sit outside of there in something like Sheets or something that's easily editable and manageable. Especially you're going to be reporting that data back out to something like Sheets anyway, if it's a survey. So having that link there is probably the best way. Putting the data in whatever you're going to store it in might make the most sense. You've only got one type of connection.
It's funny. I've had exactly that thing. Yeah, I'm exactly the same. I worked on a project once which was a touchscreen quiz for a museum installation. And so you have a timer and you have a quiz and you'd answer questions, and at the end you get a score. And at the time we had a very specific set of questions. So scriptable objects. We just made a scriptable object called a question, and a question had icons and various like text and some of the localization information. And then we have a quiz, which is just a collection of questions. And then we would load a quiz into the UI, and the UI would draw all the different questions. And that was great until it wasn't. Just exactly like you were saying, where they said the quiz went great, everyone loved it. Now we have 2 other sections we want to make quizzes for, and it's like, can we change it ourselves? And it's like, no, it's a lot of work to change it, go through all the stuff. And so exactly the same, we migrated to Google Sheets, exactly the same. And so Google Sheets was a great way for us to just have all of the different quizzes and things written out. We could basically make it a shared document with the designers and say, redo all the questions all you like, it's fine. And we'll load it up and we'll display it when it needs to be displayed. And so that's exactly the same order that we did in for our own projects.
That's funny. I guess it's You get double the answer, the same thing. Go for Sheets probably. Again, unless it's going to be tiny and you're not going to be. Oh yeah, it's going to be editable in the app. Oh okay, that might be. You could still do that with Sheets, right? You could allow it to update. In
Yep.
that case, though, you might be getting into something where you need to start thinking about your own back end later on too, depending
Yeah,
on how many
it
different
depends on
people
the
are
product.
updating
That might
it.
be API territory. Yeah, spin up a nice
Yeah.
simple REST API with like a set and get questions, and then you can have it cross platform or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, it definitely could. It could grow into something like that. I mean, I'd start again with Sheets because it's just simple. You get it working, get the application figured out, make sure that the flow is there, and you kind of know all the problems before you try to solve them in the real version. Or maybe the Google version's fine, and that is the real version. Is Unity cloth physics dead? If not, why is it not working properly? I have no idea. I don't know when the last time you did any cloth physics was. It's been a
No,
very
I
long
don't
time
use
for
Unity
me.
to one. If I need cloth physics, I use OB cloth. It's just a better plugin.
Yeah, I've just cloth physics has just never been. It's always been one of those things where I'm like, oh, that looks really cool, and then I'm like, well, I got nothing I could do with it, so I'll leave it at that. Like, it looks cool in that demo, but like, I don't know how I relate that in any way to a game. So I just kind of play with it for a few minutes. And I'm like, okay, I'll leave this to the artists and the technical artists to get super excited about it. All right.
Although, if you're
Were
looking
there
for
any?
details about Unity's one, actually, just as a side note, there's that game that's currently being made by Zero, the Unity's one, where it's like that they're making a game with the community. They have a character who's got a cloth cape on, and they're even using IK stuff for the hand, and he's got like a walking stick, and all of it works well together. I've not looked into how they did it. I assume they're using the native Unity one. So maybe if you follow the dev diary on the Unity channel for their current game they're working on, they might cover how they did their cloth physics. That might help you.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't realize they were doing that. I've loosely been following it, but not close enough to know they were doing all that. That's pretty cool. I'm gonna have to check it out. There was a question last week about combo system and animations. Um, I forget. I think we talked about this a little bit last week. Did we answer this? I can't remember if we answered this whole
I
thing
don't remember
on
the
how.
question.
So I think the question was about just how to build a. Oh, you know what? I remember. I remember now. This came up in the Q&A call for the course. Now I got it. So it came up. It was a
I was
question
late for that. Yeah.
from a course student, and it came in afterwards. And I said, "Hey, we should ask this in the call because there'll be lots of people here. There's only you here, so it didn't end up being lots of people." But I wanted to kind of get a few people's opinions and thoughts on it. I gave my answer there, but I wanted to hear what other people thought. So the essential problem was building a fighting game, which actually ties in great to my arcade setup right over there. I'll flip the screen and show everybody in a minute. We've got Street Fighter in the corner. So they're building a fighting game and they want to do combos. Like, you do punch, punch, uppercut, and then you hit the button and it does some other animation, a different move. They wanted to know how to come up with ideas for the library of animations and how you do those transitions, between them for a combo. So it's not like you hit punch and you do a punch, but you hit punch and the third one, so it does the other move and it does another animation. How do we do those transitions between the animations when they're I mean, even not just like a pre-done combo, but like, a normal animation to being able to play them as well. So thoughts? Because I mean, there's really two things there. There's combos and
Hmm.
then the animations that are pretty freeform.
Well, I haven't looked specifically into this. This is exactly one of those things where, to be honest, it's just like everybody else. I would go on an adventure for a week and I would take a load of example games. I would find out how they did it. I would watch some online courses and what the standards are. Something to come to mind though is for the input gathering, it's a buffering system. You basically want to capture the inputs into some sort of array or a stack of inputs, and then you check if each input, if you hit a combo. Usually, what you do is you take each input and you start storing them, and then you have a timeout delay. And if the last input hasn't come in within X 0.3 of a second or something, you read the collection that's there and ask if it matches the dictionary of a particular combo, and that's how you activate it. As for the animation portion of that, well, the beauty of blending animations is a lot of them will do the work in terms of blending from state to state for you, providing you set up a nice blend tree. It's after that, it's just going to be a case of managing the states. And so it's if you understand how to set up the proper state scripts, it should just be a matter of firing the right ones. And then as for the other part of that, because I don't know which part was the actual trouble bit, if you're trying to capture the events from those, the easiest way is just to have trigger boxes that are specifically tied to the frames, to the animation, and then you move them and relative to where the animation punches, the hands and stuff are. And so you can listen to the events for when the hands hit. The reason you do that is because certain animation frames will have different damage frames. And so if you follow how a lot of games do it, you might have like an uppercut where even though the uppercut, the foot, if you just put a box collider on the foot, it would only trigger a hit for the foot, but you've actually got like a nice sweeping animation where this whole area is supposed to be damageable. So again, I don't know which part in particular that question relates to, but there's the bits I know
it was
offhand.
more on the animation and the probably the state transitions and the trigger, or the going from one animation to another when it's relatively freeform too. So I mean, you kind of loosely talked about that. Do you want to? I mean, I have a couple techniques for it, but do you have any?
You go for this. I'm
that you want to
curious.
share on like how you do a transition between somewhat freeform animations? Like you say, you've got, you don't know, you got a punch and you can go from that punch to a left kick, a right kick, an uppercut, 12 other ones. You drawing that out in Mechanim? Like, it's just I figure going on to this conversation, like, I assume, like, generally you probably don't want to draw that out as all these.
No. In those cases, like, a lot of people don't realize you can't just like run an animation. You can literally just call the animation and play it, or you can assign different things. So yeah, normally in those cases, you kind of want to just have like literally the animations and run the ones you want relative to what you're doing, as opposed to building out the tree in advance. But again, really depends, because you've got scenarios where you might want to blend them manually. So yeah, there's really like
cases, one of the things I've seen done quite a few times is people just setting up a single blend and swapping out the animations in the editor, basically. So setting up a blend from one animation to another, having multiple layers, and then swapping between and weighting those layers. They're doing a blend from one to the other and then transitioning the layers at the same time, so that when they get to the second layer, they're on the other animation ready to blend into the next target. This is an interesting way to go. There's lots of things. You could just write some code, though, to do the blending as well between the two animations.
I have seen entirely manually scripted versions. I've not done it myself, but I've seen people where they make a script which is an array of animation clips, and then they'll write their own code that effectively is kind of like we said about the combo system, where they will have the animations go from this combo of this animation into this animation, and then when they run it, they will basically blend them themselves and make them. That's very code intensive. It gives you like right down to frame level control over particular things. And to kind of go back to like the rule engine, you would write rules for when this animation goes into this one and you do a transition. You basically build your own custom state machine that says currently in this punch state versus this kick state. And if you do a transition, then you could have a default transition logic, the same way that Cinemachine does for transitioning cameras. But then if you have a specific case where this kick goes to this punch, you could put an intermediary effect of some other animation that runs to get you from one to the other. Like, it really, in that case, that was a 2D sprite fighting game. So there wasn't like 3D characters blending, but there was sets of sprites that wanted to be positioned correctly to look nice. Because again, people don't realize you can use the animator for 2D sprites as well. It doesn't have to be for humanoid models. There's a lot of ways to do this, I guess, is kind of the problem.
I popped up the update on there. They're running into issues allocating the specific animations to the part of the combo. It's more about timing, like getting the animation lined up with the part of the combo. And I wish, like I said, this is one of those things where I would probably spend a week or so going through a couple different examples to find the best solution, because I can come up with a couple of solutions and mock them out in my head, but I don't know what I'm sure there are many. This has been solved hundreds of times, right? And people that have got some of the best solutions, I'd try to find out what that is, and I still haven't found it yet. I was hoping to find it. Maybe checking the Wednesday call and see if anybody there's got any good ideas too. So I'll try to make a note of that and remember to do that. Come back with it. So Perforce versus Git or versus Collaborate. Which one, Jason? Choose now.
Git, nothing else. No. If I only had to have one, it would be Git. But if I could only have two, it would be Git and Collab. If I could only have three, it would be Git, Collab, and some more Git.
I had lots of Perforce problems, but it's not that bad. Like I say that, and like I know like all the designer friends of mine are yelling at me like, "Fuck you! It is too that bad!" Like because they all drive, just drive nuts. Liam's probably rolling around, losing his mind right now. He should be on here. I don't know where he's at. He's sure he's busy, or else he'd be here. But yeah, I'm kind of the same way. I think Git is my favorite. Collab is the one that I like to use on simple projects or anything where I'm showing people who I don't want to teach Git to. Like if Git is not my main thing I'm teaching them, like I'm not going to use it. But for my own stuff, yeah, I use Git or again Collab. I haven't installed Perforce in 4 years. I think it's been a long time.
I think the last time I installed it was 2 years ago for one client in particular who had it, and that was the last time.
At one project, one game I was working on many years ago was using it, and then eventually switched to Git, so I didn't have to worry about it anymore.
But again, I wouldn't get too like these are the things. Like jokes aside, I like it's never worth getting into too much detail about which IDE do you use or which source. As long as you're using source control, I don't care. Just make sure you are using source control of some kind.
And if it's giving you problems, look at the alternatives if you can. Right? If you have the option, just try the alternatives. A lot of people are just like they'll find something that they use and it'll be a pain for them, and they'll never look at anything new. They'll stay with it forever. It's the first thing that they saw, the first thing they used, and that's what they use, and they'll never try something else. So try out other things and experiment a little bit if you run into problems. But it doesn't really matter as long as you're making some sort of you're using some sort of source control. Oh, Johnny's here. I forgot. We're gonna have him hop on next time. I think I was gonna hit him up for this one, but I missed it. Anyway, any other questions you wanted to take, or should we just jump into a couple tips? Actually, I lied. I had one more story I wanted to share. So this is just about the.
You remember the story, did you?
Yeah. No, you know what? Let's do it after. Let's go to tips, and then I'll share my story. That way, I'll have something to wrap up on. So yeah, you want to jump to tips, or were there any other questions that you wanted to hit in here first?
I guess one last one is people keep asking about Unreal. I guess I'm curious what your opinion is of the shiny new Unreal 5.
Right. Did we try Unreal 5? Have we tried? I don't know. I mean, to be honest, like I think it's cool. It's neat. It's gonna be good for game devs. The new versions of Unreal get me about as excited as like new versions of Unity do now. Like unless there's something that I'm actively going to use in it that I'm going to like use in a project, or that I think I want to use in a project, and I'm planning on doing something with it, I have a really hard time getting excited about it anymore. I used to get excited all the time, like, oh, the new thing's there. And then I would get it and I would download it, I would look at it, and I wouldn't do anything with it. And I repeated that process, I don't know, 12 times, 24 times on just different game engines, different hardware, different things that came out. And yeah, it just never ends up, if I'm not actually using it, it just doesn't end up mattering. Looks like Jason disappeared again. Jason, come back. I'm glad he didn't disappear in the middle of his tips, though. So he'll be back in a second. But yeah, in general, like I think it looks cool and all, but it's just not something that I have much to use or much use for day to day. So it's not something that I'm super excited about, only because of that. Only because I'm not using it day to day. If I were working on an Unreal game or just at a studio that was using Unreal or planning on using Unreal in a future project soon, I'd be super pumped. But without that, it's a little bit tough to really get super excited about it. I mean, it's exciting for the games that'll be coming out anyway, though. We're gonna start tips in just a second, and then as soon as Jason gets back, and I figure I'll go through here and just check to see if there are any other questions here. What is this one? And you change out the herb. So I have an idea for a third-person RPG where you play as a young priest hunting demons with chimes, and you change out the herbs. Can I do it? If you can make games, then definitely. I mean, that doesn't sound very difficult. You go around hunting demons. It's pretty simple. You got a game. Just got to make it fun. Hey, welcome back, Jason.
Thanks. Yeah, just my internet decided to take a nap.
All right, so your thoughts on Unreal? I was just telling everybody that, like, while I think it's cool, the fact that I'm not using it in anything day to day, it makes it really tough for me to get super excited about it. Like, if I had something I was going to use it for, probably be pumped, but I don't. So, your thoughts?
I put myself into two camps. One as a gamer and one as a techie. And as a techie, it's super cool. Like I really like it's visually impressive. The idea of streaming Quixel mega scans in real time with the fancy lighting is kind of insane. The level of, like, if you look at the counts that they can drop from the models is like, it's a technical marvel. It's amazing. It's really cool. And I have a feeling it'll fundamentally be game changing for visuals. But I don't care too much about it being very impressive for visuals. The truth is, and this is entirely probably down to my age, I think last generation we reached good enough graphics that if everything was last generation graphics for the rest of my life, I'd be happy, because it's good enough now that it's not distracting. It's not like comically bad. It's perfectly fine. I don't need photorealism. What I do need, though, is better narrative and storytelling and mechanical design. And so I guess I look at it as two ways. As a consumer of games, would I be happy if stuff got better and better visually, but stayed the same mechanically? I would hate that world. But if stuff stayed the same visually, but got more interesting mechanically, I would be a much happier player. So I think it's super interesting. It's technically extremely cool. But as a gamer, I kind of doesn't excite me anymore. Like, it just, like, because think about what we're talking about here. It's like it can get much prettier trees, much nicer foliage, shinier rocks. I mean, that's really cool. Like, technically, it's a marvel. I just don't care. Like, I want to have more fun in my games, you know?
How are you not pumped about shiny rocks?
I know, right?
Yeah, I'm with you. It's much more like the game that I play the most is still a card game. Graphics, it's kind of difficult for them to get amazing. They look cool, they're neat, they make it fancy and all that, but getting excited about graphics is very difficult for me too. It's probably
But again,
just
like
that
as an engine,
slow
it's
evolution.
like super impressive. Like I'm going to be finding myself reading a lot of documents and articles about how they did it and what the technology is like, and I'll really enjoy it because I totally respect. Like, there's like 2 Minute Papers, a great YouTube channel worth checking out, just for looking at where other people in other technical fields are at with fascinating technology like image recognition and all. It's just really cool and interesting. So I really love it from that perspective. But again, as a gamer, like, I just can't get excited. Like, I look at the state of play of a lot of games and I just don't find the understand, especially narrative. The understanding around narrative has not improved much in the last X number of years. Like, I can't even count we've gotten from games are no longer empty rooms you walk back and forth in. That's good, but like, it still all feels rote. It feels like we're still writing stories at the degree you'd expect of, you know, kids writing stories in school, and even really detailed and well written stories. I don't even mean that the stories are written badly. I mean that they're not using the medium of game development to present them. Like, if you play a game and the story would have been equally, if not better, told as a book, that doesn't interest me as much. I would have preferred to read the book. I want to play stories where if it wasn't a game, it wouldn't have been told as well. And so far, aside from like Nier Automata and a few other games vaguely in that category, there's just not that many games where the story and the platform it's on or the medium it's being told are intrinsically connected. And I want more energy and effort there put into how do I tell a story through the medium of game development more than shiny rocks.
Yeah, and that makes sense. 'Cause that's the interest part. The story based games, the ones where you kind of get drawn into what's happening. That's what makes it interesting, and it's hard to get drawn into. This is slightly prettier than the last one. The other thing with like visual improvements is it's so incremental. It's not like it loses the wow factor. I mean, when we went from like pointy Tomb Raider boobs to actual characters that look like real people, like, it was a huge change, right? And then ever since then, it's been better and better. And now, like, for people who can't see well, everything looks just as good as real life. Like, you're not getting a whole
I
lot
mean,
better. So.
if you want a perfect example of this, Peter Molyneux made a lot of amazing promises back in the early days of his career. He's well known for that. I won't go down the Peter Molyneux rabbit hole. But one of the most famous running jokes with Peter Molyneux is he talked about in Fable you could plant an acorn, and over the course of your gameplay it would grow into a tree, and that would, like, how would that affect the game and whatever. And apparently they actually did it. Like, it's not, the joke is that it's not in any Fable game since, but they actually did it. They did make a system that did that. But the problem was it took up, like, I think they said 60% of the CPU cycles to process all of the potential trees that were planted and growing in real time. And it was like, that's as much of a cool promise as that was, it's not worth it for the game. Now, here's my thinking. We now live in a world where we can do this amazing raycasted lighting and super cool over-engineered everything. What if we started putting some of that energy towards narrative design and this kind of idea that, like, a building is, you know, being reclaimed by nature over time, that is it actively affected, and you could then, how does that affect gameplay? Like, that may be silly, but like, we have the technology to do crazy stuff now, but it's just going into shinier rocks. And like, I would love to see a world where there's more trees growing in real time in games and stuff, like, or even if not real time, like exaggerated real time, but fundamentally, like, the gameplay is affected by what you're doing in a way that, like, it isn't presently, you know?
Yeah, that reminds me of one of my first game dev interviews that I went to. So I had this interview where I flew down to San Diego to work on Vanguard. Actually, there's no posters back there, and I had an interview with a guy who's my buddy Ed. I didn't really know him at the time, but I met with him and we were hanging out talking, and he was explaining all these new systems that they're putting into the game. At the time, it was like super secret alpha. Nobody could really see what was going on. So he's telling me, "Oh yeah, we're putting in all these cool new weather systems and stuff, and we're gonna have this snow system where snow accumulates on the ground, and as you like walk through it, it breaks away, and it's gonna have impact on gameplay, and it's gonna change like the way that the world works and stuff." And the whole time I was thinking, like, kind of interesting. I'm amazed that they're able to do that and still build out like a whole game with all this other stuff that they're doing, right? Of course, like, I realized, like, I didn't realize it at the time, but really what was happening is, like, one guy's got a side project that they think is a really neat idea, and instead of getting all the other things done on the game, you're gonna get this one neat idea done because somebody else higher up also thought it was a really cool idea and that we had to have it, and we're gonna put that in. So instead of building all the other things, instead of making it run great, getting the narrative stuff in there, we'll go put this cool system in. And I get the idea, right? Like, you get excited about it, you get thrilled, and like, oh, this is gonna be really cool. It's gonna make a big difference, and you get this whole idea in your head, but it's just very often like the pretty flashy things are just a huge distraction from actually getting shit done. I see it like they just don't. I don't know.
Well, I'm actually to double down on what you were saying. Like,
random.
I wholeheartedly agree, because like, I want to make it very, very clear that when I say that I'd love to see the energy put into these systems, I want to see them put into these systems to improve the story and gameplay. So you're 100% right that, like, there are games out there which have really cool, interesting mechanics that serve zero purpose. And in fact, like, it's a game design
minor
skill.
Purpose, like your acorns, right?
Yeah.
It's a ton of work,
like,
and
wouldn't
you
do
get
anything.
like this little benefit, like,
And it's like it's a skill, because just before this we were talking about level design stuff, and I was kind of pointing out how every step of, like, line of sight can be curated by a level designer. Like, you can actively say, from this position they can see this, I can make them have the intention of this, they will try to do this, and this will happen, and you can structure an experience a person can have. And so I don't just mean arbitrarily grow trees because whatever, because there's lots of games out there which pop in crafting mechanics because that's what big games have. And you get these boring sets of infinite crafting mechanic systems that serve no purpose to the gameplay. But I don't mean add these mechanics just because, but I'm saying there are games out there, like a great example being something like Journey, where the way Journey has its, like, sand flowing and all the way that movement works directly impacts the story and the way the gameplay is, but it's like an interesting mechanic. And there's other games which use time or use other, like, there's just, like, what was that other one, the one I've mentioned before, Archon, I think. It's a real-time strategy game which uses time travel as a mechanic. There's a running time bar of the actual time of the game running, and then you can scrub back in time and place units so they'll be built in the present based on placing them in the past. Like, that's obviously taking a lot of processing power to, like, manage paradoxes to the point where there's, like, the pro scene has paradox strategies where you can, like, spend resources that can then be deleted in time to regain the resources, to all this kind of crazy stuff. And, like, that's what I mean about, that's an insane, silly mechanic that actively changes and makes you process the way the game works differently. Now, I don't know how you'd do that with trees growing or whatever. But my point is, somebody will find a way where the act of placing trees, maybe you've got like two disparate dimensions or two different timelines, and you plant trees in the past to block obstacles or something from the future and stuff, and maybe the rate of certain trees growing at different rates will affect things, and the likelihood of them being cut down by people in the meantime, or who knows what that is. But my point is, there's ways for you to do really interesting stuff here that I just don't really see being done, you know?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think a lot of it is probably just because people have a hard time coming up with exactly what that interaction is and how you get that across. But then that's the work of the game designer, right? That's the hard part.
I've been trying not to say bullet trees for the last while. Yeah.
Design. That shit is difficult. There was a quick question about the architecture course about whether or not we're going to cover custom editors. I figured I'll just mention it in here too as well. The answer is yes. We're diving into like custom quest editors, item editors, and all that stuff later on. Anybody that's interested can check that stuff out down below, though. All right. Were there other questions you wanted to hit, or should we jump into?
No, I think that's
you had a
probably
nice
it,
big
yeah.
list of tips, right?
Just a few, nothing too crazy. I didn't go too bad. But actually, I'm going to start with one tip that you can give because I saw it in the course and I was like, "Ooh, that's one that Jason should mention." When you're playing the game and you lose access to your mouse because of the cursor hiding, how would you pause it?
Oh, I usually hit Control P.
Control P. There you go.
That's like the one.
That's one that you'd be surprised that a lot of people won't know about. But like, because how many of you have built a project and you've lost the mouse, or the mouse has been eaten by the character controller, and you're like desperately trying to find the mouse to click the stop button to run it? Control P. Control P will basically pause the editor so you can get back to what you were controlling it again.
Yep. It'll also start it for you too. So if you're like paused or you're not playing, you can just hit Control P to kick that off. I get that all the time when I do. It's the second that I say that mouse.cursor equals whatever cursor mode.lock or mouse mode.lock.
I get actually like this. I get uncomfortable every time I write that line because I'm like, this is going to be painful. At some stage, it's going to eat the mouse and I'm going to get very annoyed. And so every time I write that line, I'm like, if not in editor or something, just so I can cover myself, you know?
Oh yeah, I'll usually make it so that I can hold down the shift key to undo it.
That's smart.
It'll have it in there in a text. I can hold that down. Another thing that happens to me a lot too, by the way, anybody, if this does happen to you, is that Unity will eat my mouse and I can't get it back at all, especially if you got a multi-monitor setup. The fix for that, the only thing that I can do is Control-Alt-Delete and then hit escape. It pops up like the Windows, like the full screen thing, and it takes over the cursor. It just like resets. I don't know what it does exactly. It does something to the cursor, resets it, I hit escape, and my mouse is back right there in the middle. So another good little trick, at least on Windows. I don't know on Mac.
Yeah,
or
I
if
do that
it's
on Windows too. So I'm not
might
sure.
not happen on a Mac. You know. But yeah,
I used to have that problem a lot with. Yeah, the editor would be in one screen and my other monitor would have notes, and suddenly the mouse would be lost and I couldn't get it anymore. So I've had that exact problem.
Yeah, I keep running into the issue now where I've got the screen back there. Let me switch views real quick. Back there, I set up as monitor. So every time I drag my mouse or anything too far to the right, it goes flying away and I can't see it. And that's not actually on monitor mode now, so I can't see anything there either. And I don't know where my mouse went. And I think I got to hit Control-Alt-Delete, and I really just got to move the thing over. Anyway, tips. So you want to, that was my beautiful tip. Hit Control-P to start and stop. Also, Control-Shift-V to paste without formatting. Those two hotkeys that I use all the freaking time. Oh, and what is it? Control-Shift-Escape. That's it. For bringing up the task manager too in Windows. Hotkeys that I use all the freaking time. Go ahead. I was just trying to get my words right.
Yeah, so one that I think you'll get a kick out of because you covered it again, like I just saw it recently, was the pivot points for ProBuilder. So if you have a ProBuilder object and you're setting the pivot point, so one of them is you can literally like pick a vert and set the point for the anchor for it. But did you know if you want to set it without having to subdivide the mesh to make more points, what you can do is, so it's a bit messy, but it's the way I do it to keep model simple. I'll make an empty game object and I'll call it origin, and I will then center it in the game view and I'll put the label on it so it physically says origin in my scene. Then I will hide all the other objects. I will make my new object. I will zero it out. I will then make whatever shape I'm trying to do, and then I will snap and anchor it so the origin sits where I want to. And there's a button called freeze transform. And what the freeze transform button does is it'll set the pivot to the exact 000. So if you wanted something like, in my case, I had a door and it was really thin. The door was like 0.125 units. And if I wanted to put the pivot on the halfway along that, but I didn't want to have subdivided mesh, I could just I could basically place it there, nudge it in the inspector. So even though there's no point there, I would then freeze the transform against the end of that corner. So you can basically place the pivot on a non-vert, providing you use it relative to the origin point of the entire scene view when you're editing. So it's a bit messy, but you do it once and you're like, now I have a thing with the correct child pivot set, you know?
Yeah, that's definitely a very handy trick. Getting those things offset right is always kind of a pain in the ass. Like getting especially characters. I hate when characters are set up wrong. I don't know if you get that, but I'd say maybe 1 out of 4 characters that I get is set up completely wrong. They're like rotated sideways, the pivot's in the middle, or they're at a scale like the size of a mountain or something. You know, like
the one I get a lot is an artist will give me like a scene with a bunch of different elements in it, and every element's origin will be the same one because it'll be the origin for the scene and every child object. And so you try to rotate like this tree, and then the tree rotates around the center of the map for some weird reason. You're like, that's not. Why is the pivot for this object miles over there?
The center of the world. Yeah, that's always fun stuff, man. All right, I'll let you do another tip. What else you got?
The next one, it's kind of more of it is a tip, but it's like just something to keep an eye on. When you first start, by default, you'll start using a lot of lists. And then sometimes you'll start looking into performance. Then you start using a lot of arrays. And you'll be like, oh, arrays are basically performant lists. But a lot of people don't actually take the time to learn other collection types. So yes, you probably heard of stacks and queues and whatever. But there's also sets. And sets are specifically if you need unique elements in the array and you don't want it to add the same thing multiple times. And so I guess my tip is if you find yourself writing code like, if I try to add this to the list and it already exists in the list, don't add it, maybe ask yourself if you're using the right collection type. Maybe it might actually, internally, you could use a hash set or something instead.
Which will do exactly that for you, right? It's like literally a list built to keep duplicates out. So.
Yeah, and the same thing, if you had a collection where you're adding elements to it and you're like, oh, I want to know whenever a new element is added, you could do a check every time you add an element, or you could use an observable collection, which by design is meant to fire events every time. Or you might want your own collection, and so if you create your own class and extend from the collection base type, it'll give you methods to override to provide functionality for items added and removed, and then you can add your own code to kind of customize it. So effectively, collections are not... There's not one type of collection. There's linked lists and all sorts of other crazy ones that do different stuff. So the tip, I guess, is look into what they are and why they're there. And like we discussed earlier with databases, there's different reasons why you'd use them. Some have fast lookup times. Some have fast iteration times. Some have fast access, like random access. Some of them have no random access, but they have like unique features like stacks and queues. And so it really depends what you're looking for. So just look at collections and find the right one for what you're doing.
Can we talk for 1 second about the observable collections? Because I've used them. I bet that most people here haven't used them. Actually, if you're in chat, if you have never used observable collections, can you just say so now? I'm just kind of curious. Or just say yes or no if you've used them. I'm kind of curious. But can you just explain what they are and what the benefit is? Because they are pretty freaking useful and pretty handy. I very rarely end up using them in games.
Same. I actually find I can use
scenarios where they make sense. And you can just tell everybody what an observable collection is and does.
Yeah, so we'll say a collection is a collection of stuff. That's fairly straightforward. And then I'll do this staccato again like I did earlier because I think it explains it better. So there's individual items, and then there's arrays. And an array is just a collection of items. And it's a fixed size collection of items. So array of 5 or 10, it defaults to 10, and you can have 10 items in that collection. If you try to add an 11th item, it'll crap out. It'll say, I can only fit 10. So what do you do if you want more than a set size set of items, but you want more than one of them? Well, that's where you use a list. Why a list? Well, a list internally uses an array, but what it does is when you hit past that 10, it doubles to 20. And when you hit past the 20, it doubles to 40, and it kind of goes up. it's 2816. I can't remember the order, but it basically effectively doubles in size on a regular basis whenever you hit the cap limit. Or is it? Well, at least it really depends. Certain collections
It
double,
grows.
certain collections
It auto
yeah.
grows.
It auto grows. That's the point. So a list is basically an auto growing array. That's the point of a list. And so as we go down this rabbit hole more, there's other kinds of collections that do different things. And one of them is an observable collection. And what an observable collection does is it's exactly the same as a list, as we've described. It's an auto growing sized array, but there's an event on it that says whenever an object has been added or removed from this collection, fire an event. So rather than having to do a check by iterating a list to make sure the items are in it or there's other things, you can subscribe to events that have changed on that list, and it just makes your life easier for that kind of code. So yeah, that's specifically what I use it for whenever I have a collection. So I talked earlier about MVVM versus MVC and all that. It's often used in MVVM as a way of having a collection of items in a UI, like a drop-down box or a collection of list items, where if you change one of the elements, you want to be able to do something interesting. Well, if you use an observable collection, it's got a binding event, iNotifyPropertyChangeHandler, that you can subscribe to that will effectively mean if anyone clicks an element in the UI, the data knows to update and change. So it's a self-updating event loop, effectively.
Yeah, it's self-updating the list. Here, let me screen share the just the page for it too. You can see what it is. It essentially fires off this changed event, the collection changed event, whenever anything is added, removed, changed, or moved. I'm not sure what the changed exactly is. It's just replacing an entry, right? Not actually like the data for that object changing itself. But
because it's used for like I said, it's used in views for if the field data, if it's been basically accessed and altered in terms of its hash. Because what that does, to be more accurate, is every item is stored in these collections by using the hash code, and the hash code is effectively generated by doing an operation on each of the fields of data. So that one will fire if a field of data has changed such that the actual hash code changes, and so forth. The item itself has changed its values, even if it's not been moved from its position in its collection.
Yeah, that's pretty freaking cool, right? So you just observe to this, and then you get back an event, and you'll know when the thing's been changed. So super handy. Definitely something people should understand, and just all of the collections. Because I think that people generally they learn arrays, then they learn lists, and then they're done.
Actually, okay, if you like this one that's tangential to this, I wasn't going to talk about it, but it's relevant, I guess. A lot of people don't realize you can do this with pretty much anything, including file systems. And so I have a snippet of, I don't have the code here, but I have the example project if I can find it.
Digging it up.
Yeah, I'm just looking for a GIF here. Here we go. So here is a demonstration of something that kind of falls into this category.
All right, we'll pull that up. By the way, I was noticing that when we were going through, most people did not know about the observable collections. It seems like it's a relatively new thing for most people, which is cool because it's always awesome to learn some new stuff. All right, let's pop up this one right here. Oh, and it just disappeared the second I started scrolling. So we'll refresh it and see if I can get it. Okay, is there a reason I can't scroll this thing? What? Okay, let's zoom.
It's got a little box in the corner. Maybe the full screen at first.
Yeah, it was. There we go. Yeah, it just whenever I zoom it, it would just disappear the entire window. So.
If you hit the little, there we go, cool. So it's hard to really tell what's going on here. It's not that relevant. My point is, this is a Unity application on the right that is using what's called a folder watcher, and here's a folder on the left that's on the desktop. And as I'm changing the contents or deleting it or adding it, I'm looking for this savedata.txt file. And as you can see, live in Unity, I'm able to update and be aware of altered changes to that file. And so this is the kind of thing you would use if you're doing something fun, like how Undertale has or Doki Doki Literature Club has, if you can change the file externally, you can have the game do weird stuff and be aware of what you're doing. But what most people don't realize is you don't have to do it on load of the game. You can attach what's called a folder watcher to that directory, listen for events from the operating system, and then the operating system can let you know if each, just like I said with the observable collection, it can let you know, was any file changed, was a directory added, was all this kind of stuff. And so I built a wrapper around that called like watched file or something, and I can just define a watched file on my desktop, which is in the save directory. And if somebody messes with the save file in real time, it lets me go in and say, oh, hang on a second, I found a file has been added or created and whatever. And you could have the game do something fun like, oh, I notice you're playing with the save file data. I probably wouldn't recommend doing that. You can do whatever you like. And so if you want to look into that more, it's the folder watcher. But it's the same principle, right? It's the same principle as an observable collection. It's got some nuances to watch, though, because it fires all events. I don't want to get into the whole thing. You basically choose which events you're listening to, and it can be confusing at first because it's not sanitized as something as simple as it's been created, it's been destroyed, because an act of like deleting it is actually like, if moving it's actually deleting it and moving it. So it's like events are strange in an operating system. So you read up on it before you just assume, because it'll feel like it's broken until you know what you're doing. But it's cool. It's another fun thing that falls into that category of like observing data changes,
Yeah, those things are awesome. Observing folder. I remember when I first found out you could observe files and folders. I was like, oh, wow, this is sweet. I can just set up, and my use case wasn't nearly as fun and interesting. Like setting up things to watch for files to appear, game log files specifically, and parse out my damage. Like, bam, I got a new log file. I can check my damage, and I don't have to go hit open file. Like, oh, this is amazing.
We actually had that on. We did something similar, but it was for an import processor. So what would happen is clients would FTP files into a directory, into an inbox directory, and then the inbox directory would then read new files incoming, parse them, split them up, create transactions, throw the transactions to the database, which would store the data. Then once all the data has been loaded, it would call a lambda expression that would then run against that to parse all the data and then add it and then recalculate the totals. So it was like this whole pipeline of drop file in and suddenly all this magic starts happening. It was really cool.
Yeah, those are always fun. I remember doing some similar types of things. And yeah, that thing is just neat. The file watcher, just grabbing it. And you can also get like updates to the file and just keep reloading and update the file. Like you used to do that with log files too, just not just for the games, but for the data import stuff. Watching when I mentioned they would scan every hour, I also had one log that would scan continuously, and it would just watch the specific file. That was a very a weird use case and an edge case where I actually needed to monitor it. But most of the time, yeah, it's just watching the folder and looking for stuff. It's cool. Observable stuff's just awesome. And it's just events in general, I think, are something that are super powerful and people don't
There
realize.
is something very satisfying about that. Like another thing too is people don't realize this with Windows. You can actually use the interop pinvoke stuff to grab. Oh,
my battery fell asleep.
No,
it's tired. I'm gonna make you full screen. Or
okay, I guess I'll have to be interesting.
It'll wake up in just a second.
So yeah, what you can do is you can use the pinvoke stuff in Windows to subscribe to all of the operating system events, and because it's a giant pipeline of events, things like Windows resized or all sorts of other crazy stuff, transparency requests, just everything. There's tons of stuff your operating system is doing all of the time in terms of events in Windows and all that, and you can subscribe to those. And so once you do that, you can override the events, write your own handlers, all sorts of other crazy stuff. And some examples of this you might have seen if you look at some of the itch examples. There's people who've made games where their windows are invisible. So there's actually like no window as you'd normally have in a game. Or inversely, you can read the positional data of the windows in the operating system, generate bounding boxes, and then effectively have your character interact with your operating system and the windows and stuff. And there's all sorts of other crazy things like that you can do. So yeah, the pinvoke stuff's really cool. There's a lot of these event systems you can subscribe to and engage with.
Yeah, hold on. I'm rejoining real quick on my phone. There we go. Popping in. I figure I'll come in as a second person. Looks really weird.
Can't hear you, unfortunately. Your mic seems dead. I think because your mic was attached to the other video instance.
Oh, there we go. Yeah. I had the wrong one on. Ah!
Good old technical difficulties.
Okay, there we go. All better.
There we go. Yeah, it works.
Just had to mute out the other one and kill it completely. Yeah, that was strange. Yeah, that's weird. The camera actually has power right there. It's plugged in. It's charging. Oh, there's the arcade. There, I'll show it to everybody. I mentioned the arcade setup earlier. There's a video about that that'll be coming out. Oh, sorry, way up in my face later on today. So if you're not subscribed and all that, make sure that you do now so that you see that in just a little bit. And there's the old one, the NBA Jam. It's going away. Really sad. Anyway, you still there, Jason?
I am indeed. Yep.
Okay, cool. Just making sure because I couldn't hear anything. So that was a good tip. I'm gonna just jump into my tip real quick in case everything falls apart real quick with my phone and I'm not able to rejoin. And that was just on lists in the inspector. It's something that I've mentioned a couple times before, and I personally forget about all the time too. Back in the day when I started using Unity, you could not use a list in the inspector. If you made it public, it wouldn't show up. If you made it serialized, it wouldn't show up in the inspector. Only an array would work. Nothing else would work. And then I don't know if it was 2018 or 19 where they finally fixed it. I think it was 2018 point something where they finally fixed it up, and you can actually just serialize a list into.
But just for confusion, people. We're not saying it could never use work. Lists used to not work. That was the subtle difference. So yeah, that used to be confusing.
Yeah, it would drive me nuts because like I would do it and so I kind of learned over the first many years of, first 5, 6, 7 years of Unity development to never use lists in there. It's fixed though. It's changed. You can use lists in the inspector. You can rearrange things when they're in lists in the inspector, and there's really just no downside to it. So I highly recommend just trying that out and try to remember that it exists. That's always the hardest part for me. Let's see if my other camera is going to pop back on now, if it's already charged up, because I'm super choppy here. I don't think so. Oh, there we go. It's looking good. So let's switch back up.
Actually, speaking of the list one, there's one related to that that's pretty cool. So we've talked before about context menus. So if you're not making buttons, but you're just doing like I want a right-click menu to invoke some function, that's quite handy, right? The alternative is that, or make a whole button and custom editor and that stuff. But there's one called context menu item. So not context menu item. And what that lets you do is put a context menu over a field and then choose what function gets called when the field is right-clicked. So instead of right-clicking the script and having a bunch of stuff, you can right-click an individual field. But the reason I bring it up isn't because that's cool enough, but it's just where it exists. Where it's interesting is just like you were saying with the list. If you put it over a list, it'll show up over each item. So effectively, you have 10 items in a list. You can right-click a list item and perform an action on that list item, which is really cool if you've got like list items where you want to be able to affect each one individually, or like you might have like a right-click capitalize function on one of the name fields for your items or something. And you could have custom behaviors that are right-click behaviors on side of your own scripts without writing a custom inspector. That one's always fun.
Oh, that is the cool. I hadn't thought about that. I didn't realize you could do it in the list there. That's a neat little thing.
Yeah. So it lets you like handle, at least I'm thinking about this wrong. I think I remember it working with the element that you select, not the list itself. So if you have a list of items and you wanted to right click element 5 and do something with that data, you would then, respond to that.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's interesting. And that was context menu item for everybody.
Context menu item, yeah.
Context menu, yeah. Context menu is super handy too. Just being able to call code. Anybody that hasn't used those, you just add them in and you call the code. You add it as an attribute above a method, and then you can just call that method and it'll just run from the editor. Great for debugging, setting stuff up, or fixing up data, like I said, with capitalization type stuff, or whatever other data fix ups you want to do. Cool. Are we done with tips? Did you have any others, or
a couple of other small ones? So one of them is quick enough. And I'm kind of hesitant to give this one because I think people will misuse it. So don't misuse it. Normally, if you need to get an array of data or a collection of data returned, normally you have to create a new list and then return every element one by one, or like you add it all to the list and then return the list. And an IEnumerable is just a collection of things. Well, it's an enumerable collection of things. So what you can do is if you make an IEnumerable numbers, you can just say yield return 1, yield return 2, yield return 3, and it'll create an IEnumerable in real time and return it. It doesn't seem as valuable for 1, 2, 3, but if you wanted to create a list that returned, all of the numbers using, all within a particular range, and you're doing some equation on them, you could just say for int I equals whatever, I less than 0, yield return some calculation. And it will create a collection whereby each element is the resulting calculation in line without you having to make a list, do the equation, add to the list, return the list at the end. So learning that you can just yield return the set of the result set of your data is a quite nice one. But there's performance cost because it doesn't return as an array, it returns as an IEnumerable, which then has to be enumerated, which has other performance concerns. So I guess my point is, if you have a generator, if you got something like generate pi to x places, or generate, whatever other equation you want, look into using IEnumerators to perform that generation and return it as an enumerable set. So that one's pretty good. And then the last one I have here is random state. This one was particularly fun because I actually only learned about this very recently because it came up in one of the Discords. You can, if you're using a random generator, either Unity's random one or system.random, and you're generating random data over time. Well, if you save your game and then exit and then come back, the seed for that random is going to be a new seed. So that from that point on, it's not going to be repeatably the same random data, which you might want depending on what kind of card game or something you're doing. And even if you set it to the exact same seed as it was before you saved, it still won't be right because the seed will have been a certain number of steps in. So it's like a random generator will generate 15 numbers, and then when you load back in and you put the same seed in, you'll get number 1 again for the next question, not 16, which you need to maintain the consistency of the random generation. But what you can do is you can actually save out the hashed state of either random field. So basically, if you want to be able to maintain consistency with your randomization, you can literally save out the state of either random tool and then load it back in at the start so it maintains where it was in its seed's random position. It's very niche to need that, but it's really cool because it means if you want to have a deterministic set of random data, you can, even if you are pausing it and coming back in later.
Yeah, that's really important if you want to just build a deterministic game, I think. So it applies to quite a few game types. There's some other solutions I've seen. So for setting the state, or set is just property on there that you just set and get, or
yeah, it's different for both. Like one of them is the Unity one of them is I think it's get state, and one of them is get. I can't remember the exact syntax, but there is a function on either which gets you that value.
Oh, okay. That's definitely a super handy one for anybody building that kind of game. Cool. I guess we're done with tips. I had a little story I was going to share, but I don't know. Maybe I'll save it for next time. It's just about designers and not asking for things. It was a good and interesting, but I think I might save it and we can just start to wrap things up before my camera dies again on me in the middle of it. I don't know. Is there anything else you wanted to just talk about real quick, or any other final questions you want to hit? Otherwise, I guess
no, that's it. I'm good.
Gonna cut this and see everybody again next week. We'll go over some more questions, maybe have some more people. I wanted to get Johnny in here from Turbo Makes Games, and there are a couple other people who've reached out, and I've been trying to get back, but just overwhelmed on time right now. Just trying to catch up with everything. Later on today, I'm going to be releasing a video again on the arcade stuff, just on converting them, making it so you can run Unity games on there. Just talk a little bit about the process. Not going to go too deep into the building and conversion stuff, but eventually more in that if people are interested in it. And I also think everybody should just go look at Jason Story's game design playlist, because it's just good stuff there, and it's super useful, and it'll make your games better than some micro optimization that you're going to make to it. Right?
There's level design stuff there too, as well, by the way. So there's don't just look at the UI stuff. There's a whole load of playlists on level design and how to just a load of, and anything that I think is tangentially relevant to game design. There's probably something in there,
and it's probably very relevant. So you should probably go check it out. Anyway, thanks again, Jason. Thanks again, everybody, for coming out here and watching and joining us here and saying hello and all that stuff. Thanks for all the super chats. And I guess we'll see you again next week. Make sure you like, subscribe, share. Go check out
all
Jason's
of that
thing,
jazz.
send him some coffee.
Oh yeah, and if you want any updates from me, if I ever do anything, there's a link in the doodly doo, as they say. It's to my Ko-fi page. Any updates I have on sample projects or blog articles or whatever I write is going to go there. So that's where you can keep up on whatever the hell I figure out I'm going to do.
I think that link in the doodly doo is the best part of this. The best part of this stream. All right. Thanks again, everybody. Thanks again, Jason. And we will see you all soon. As I hit the button and wave goodbye to everybody.